There is a mountain in Italy that the winter of 1944 turned into the edge of the world. Not a large mountain by the standards of the Alps or the Apennines, not a mountain that would draw your eye on any ordinary day, but in the first months of that year, it became the place where the Allied campaign to liberate Europe ground to a halt, where ambition met stone, where strategy met mud, where the ancient and the modern collided in a way that no one who survived it ever fully left behind. At its summit, a monastery had stood for 14 centuries. Built in a time when the Roman Empire was still a living memory, it had weathered plague, earthquake, and the long dark centuries of war and forgetting. It had been the keeper of knowledge when knowledge had almost no other home in the Western world. Its walls had sheltered manuscripts, monks, and pilgrims across more than 1,000 years of European history, and in the winter of 1944, it found itself at the exact center of the most consequential military campaign in the Mediterranean theater of the Second World War. What happened at Monte Cassino was not a single battle, it was 4 battles. It was a siege that lasted months. It was a question, moral, strategic, and deeply human, that commanders argued over in tents and briefing rooms, while soldiers died in the cold on the slopes below. It was the story of American infantrymen, British engineers, Indian divisions, New Zealand assault troops, French colonial forces, and Polish soldiers who carried within them a grief so vast it had no name, all of them pressing against the same wall, in the same mud, under the same shell fire, month after month, winter into spring. It was also, by any honest accounting, a story of catastrophic miscalculation, of a decision made in uncertainty that resolved nothing militarily and destroyed something irreplaceable, of a bombing so colossal it rewrote the world of a hilltop, and then handed the defenders a better fortress than the one they had never been using in the first place. And it was a story of what happens when human will refuses to accept that a wall cannot be broken. This is the complete history of the Battle of Cassino Monastery. If you have found this film at the end of a long day or the beginning of a sleepless night, then you are exactly the person this was made for. Let the narration carry you. Let the detail be the thing that eases you down. These are real events, real places, real people. Some of them were frightened and cold and far from home. Some of them made decisions they spent the rest of their lives revisiting. Some of them never came home at all. Their story deserves to be told carefully and at length, and without rushing toward a conclusion that erases the cost of what it took to get there. So settle in. If you have a blanket, pull it a little closer. If the room is quiet, let it stay quiet. We are going to take our time with this one. Because the Battle of Cassino is not a story that rewards impatience. It begins in the autumn of 1943, with an Allied campaign that had started full of optimism and had already begun to bruise against reality. Italy had surrendered as a co-belligerent. Mussolini had fallen. The invasion of the Italian mainland seemed, at first, to promise a rapid advance northward, a route into the soft underbelly of Axis-controlled Europe, as it had been described in the strategic conversations of the great powers. The reality was something else entirely. Italy is a country designed by geography to favor the defender. The peninsula is a spine of mountains running north to south, fractured by rivers that in autumn and winter become rushing obstacles, flanked by coastlines that narrow the available ground for any attacker trying to push northward in force. Every ridge offers a new firing position. Every valley funnels advancing troops into concentrated kill zones. Every town becomes a fortress. Every monastery on every hill becomes a question mark. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood this better than almost any commander on either side. The German defensive system he constructed across the narrowest part of the peninsula, the line that ran from sea to sea just south of Rome, was not merely a line of trenches and wire. It was a geological argument. It used the land itself as the primary weapon. The peaks and river crossings and hilltop positions were not supplemented by engineering. They were engineering. The bunkers and gun emplacements and interlocking fields of fire were the finishing touches on a defensive masterwork that the Italian terrain had largely designed for him. And at the center of that line, above the valley through which any advance toward Rome was forced to pass, stood Monte Cassino, 1,700 meters of rock and winter, and at its peak, the ancient white walls of the Abbey of Saint Benedict. For the men looking up at it from the valley floor, it was impossible not to believe that those walls were watching them. For the commanders trying to break through, the monastery became an obsession, a symbol of everything immovable, everything that resisted, everything that the campaign had become. Month after month, the question would recur: what was happening inside those walls? Were German observers using them to direct artillery fire down onto Allied positions? Were their troops concealed within? Was the ancient structure being used as a shield? The answers to those questions, when they finally came, arrived too late to change what had already been done. What followed the bombing of the monastery on the 15th of February 1944 would become one of the most debated decisions of the entire war, a decision examined in post-war inquiries, in military histories, in the memoirs of generals, and in the quieter reckonings of the men who had watched it happen from the slopes below. 1,000 tons of bombs, a structure that had stood since the 6th century, and the discovery, in the aftermath, that the rubble made a more effective fortress than the building had ever been. Across 18 chapters, this film will walk through every stage of that campaign: the geography and the fortifications, the commanders and the men, the 4 separate assaults, each more costly than the last, the arrival of the Polish Corps, soldiers fighting not just for a military objective, but for an idea of a home they had already lost and were desperate to reclaim, the breakthrough that finally came in May and what it cost, the road to Rome, and the long, complicated legacy of a battle that nobody who studied it carefully could call straightforward. There are moments in this story where the courage on display is difficult to comprehend from a safe distance. There are moments where the decisions made by men in warm rooms cost other men their lives in the cold. There are moments of near tragedy and delayed triumph, of plans that dissolved in fog and mud, and of soldiers who advanced anyway because that was what was asked of them. If this is your first time hearing this story, take it slowly. If you already know the broad outlines and want the texture and detail, we will not disappoint you. This film does not rush. It does not skip the difficult parts. It follows the campaign in full, from the first patrols along the frozen Rapido River to the moment Polish soldiers planted their flag on the ruins of the monastery summit and the Gustav Line, that monument to human engineering and natural geography, finally, after all those months, began to crack. If you have not already, please consider subscribing. Films like this one take time to research and build, and your support makes it possible to keep telling the stories that deserve the space they need. Now, close your eyes if you want to, or keep them open and watch the world of southern Italy in winter, the grey sky, the brown river, the white peak. The battle is about to begin. The winter of 1943 settled over the Italian peninsula with a particular cruelty. Rain fell in sheets across the Apennines, turning roads into rivers and fields into bogs that swallowed vehicles whole. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was a weapon in itself, working against men already exhausted from months of hard fighting northward from Sicily. Allied soldiers who had crossed the Mediterranean with visions of a swift march through what Winston Churchill had called the soft underbelly of Europe found themselves staring instead at something altogether more formidable. The terrain pushed back, the weather pushed back, and somewhere ahead, carved into the very rock of the mountains, the Germans had built a wall. Not a metaphor, not a line on a map, a genuine fortress system that stretched from coast to coast across the narrowest waist of the Italian boot, and it was waiting. The campaign in Italy had begun with genuine momentum. The Allied landings in Sicily during the summer of 1943 had succeeded. The subsequent invasion of the Italian mainland had seemed, at first, to confirm the optimism of those who believed Italy might be knocked out of the war swiftly, its people exhausted, and its government already quietly negotiating surrender. And in fact, Italy had switched sides in September of that year, signing an armistice that removed it from the Axis camp and opened what planners in London and Washington hoped would be a rapid corridor northward. But a signature on paper meant very little when German divisions were already flooding down from the Alps and the Brenner Pass, determined to hold every kilometre of Italian soil. The Germans had not retreated, they had simply stopped running and turned around. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was not a man inclined to panic. Where other commanders might have seen Italy's mountain geography as a burden, he saw it as a gift. The peninsula is long and narrow, and the Apennine Mountains run like a spine down its length, pushing any army moving north into a series of valleys and river crossings, each one a natural choke point, each one a place where a disciplined defending force could bleed an attacker white. Kesselring used the autumn of 1943 to construct a defensive line of staggering depth and ingenuity, one that would turn the hills and rivers of central Italy into interlocking fields of fire, bunkers, wire, and mines. By the time Allied forces began pressing seriously northward, this line was waiting for them, and it had a name: the Gustav Line. It would become the defining geographic reality of the entire Italian campaign. The Gustav Line ran roughly east to west across the peninsula, anchored on the Tyrrhenian coast to the west and the Adriatic coast to the east. Its western anchor rested in the mountains above the town of Cassino, a modest Italian town sitting in the Liri Valley at the foot of a great rocky massif. To cross the Liri Valley, to push through toward the towns beyond and eventually reach Rome, an army had first to get past Cassino. The valley was the only practical route. On either side of it rose mountains too steep for armoured vehicles, too exposed for infantry, unsupported by artillery, and too well defended by German positions dug into every promontory and ridge. The Liri Valley was the key, and the key to the Liri Valley sat on the mountain above, Monte Cassino. The mountain rises to roughly 1,700 metres at its peak, a great grey massif of rock and scrub that dominates the valley below in the way that a fortress dominates a medieval town, completely, oppressively, unavoidably. From the summit, an observer with good binoculars can see for enormous distances in every direction. Every road in the valley below is visible. Every column of trucks, every gathering of troops, every artillery battery moving into position, all of it exposed to the eyes of anyone watching from above. In military terms, observation is power. Observation allows artillery to be directed with precision. It allows defenders to anticipate movements, to call in fire on concentrations of men before they can organize an assault. Monte Cassino was, in this sense, not just a mountain. It was a command center for the entire surrounding battlefield, simply by virtue of where it stood, and at its summit, surrounded by walls that had stood for over a millennium, sat the Monastery of Monte Cassino. Allied soldiers pushing northward through the autumn of 1943 found their progress slowing, then stopping. The Fifth Army under the American General Mark Clark pushed up the western side of the peninsula, repeatedly running into defensive positions of brutal effectiveness. The terrain channeled every advance into killing grounds, river crossings under fire, mountain paths swept by machine guns, towns turned into fortresses. By November, the advance had ground nearly to a halt. By December, it was clear that the Gustav Line was not going to be breached by momentum alone. There would have to be deliberate planning, concentrated force, and a willingness to absorb casualties on a scale that made some commanders deeply uncomfortable. The war in the West, the beaches of Normandy, was still months away. Italy was, for the moment, the primary theatre of Allied ground operations in Europe. The pressure to produce results was immense. The mood in Allied headquarters that winter carried a particular weight. Senior commanders understood the mathematics of the situation with painful clarity. Every week that the Gustav Line held was a week in which German forces could reinforce, consolidate, and improve their positions. Every week was also a week in which Allied strength was being consumed. Men, ammunition, equipment, and perhaps most importantly, the confidence of soldiers who had been told that Italy would yield quickly. That confidence had to be maintained, and yet the reality visible from any forward observation post told a different story. The mud, the cold, the German artillery, and the mountains. These were the true rulers of Italy in the winter of 1943 and into the new year of 1944. Behind the military calculus lay a deeper strategic question that had divided Allied leaders almost since the Italian campaign began. The Americans, and particularly the planners in Washington, had never been entirely enthusiastic about Italy. They had agreed to it as a way of keeping pressure on Germany while the cross-channel invasion of France was being prepared, but they watched the commitment deepen with growing unease. Every division tied down in the Italian mountains was a division not available for the operations in France that would, the Americans believed, actually end the war. The British, and Churchill in particular, believed more firmly in the Italian campaign's value as a means of drawing German forces southward, away from France and the Eastern Front. This fundamental disagreement, never fully resolved, would shape how resources were allocated and how urgently the Gustav Line was pressed. The men fighting in the cold valleys below Monte Cassino were caught inside this larger argument. The monastery itself, in the winter of 1943, moving into 44, still stood. Its great white walls rose from the peak of the mountain and could be seen from the valley floor on clear days. A pale rectangle against the grey rock, ancient and somehow permanent seeming in a landscape that was being torn to pieces around it. Founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, it had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across its long history, and it had accumulated across those centuries a reputation as one of the great centers of Western learning and faith. Its library had held manuscripts of extraordinary age and value. Its walls had sheltered monks, pilgrims, scholars, and in the chaos of the ongoing war, refugees from the fighting, Italian civilians who had fled the destruction of their homes in the valley below and found in the monastery a place of apparent safety. The abbot, who had remained throughout, was attempting to maintain the monastery as neutral ground, a place apart from the killing surrounding it. Whether the monastery could truly remain apart from the war would become one of the most agonizing questions of the entire Italian campaign. But in the closing weeks of 1943, that question had not yet forced itself into the sharpest focus. What had forced itself into focus, with the cold clarity of military necessity, was the simple fact that the mountain had to fall. Rome lay roughly 140 kilometers to the north. Between Rome and the Allied lines stood the Gustav Line, and at the heart of the Gustav Line stood Monte Cassino. Every other strategic calculation radiated outward from this single geographic reality. Flank the mountain, assault it directly, bypass it through the sea. Every plan that Allied planners considered began and ended with the same inescapable conclusion. Monte Cassino had to be dealt with. The question was only how. The soldiers who would have to answer that question in blood were already moving into position. American infantry who had crossed the Atlantic with little sense of what Italian winter warfare would demand. British and Commonwealth troops, veterans of the Desert War, now confronted with an entirely different kind of fighting on entirely different ground. French colonial forces who had come from North Africa, New Zealanders, Indians, Poles. The Allied coalition in Italy was a remarkable mosaic of nations, united by a common purpose and by the common misery of the conditions they found themselves in. They looked up at the mountain as soldiers have always looked at obstacles placed between them and their objective, with a grim and practical respect, with whatever reserves of courage they could find inside themselves, and with the knowledge that what lay ahead would not be quick, would not be clean, and would not be anything other than very, very hard. The mountain waited, as mountains always do, patient, enormous, indifferent to the plans of generals and the suffering of the men below. The campaign for Cassino was about to begin. There are places in the world that seem to exist outside of time, places where the centuries accumulate not as dust, but as something almost living, something that breathes and remembers. The Monastery of Monte Cassino is one of those places. Perched at the crown of a mountain rising more than 500 meters above the valley floor, it had watched empires rise and collapse, armies march and disappear, plagues sweep through the lowlands and exhaust themselves before the altitude. It had been destroyed before, by the Lombards in the 6th century, by the Saracens in the 9th, by an earthquake in the 14th, and each time it had been rebuilt, stone by stone, as though the idea of the place was simply too important to surrender to catastrophe. By the time the winter of 1943 arrived, and the first Allied soldiers looked up from the valley and squinted at its white walls, catching the pale light, the monastery had endured for roughly 1400 years. That endurance was not incidental. It was, in a very real sense, the point. Saint Benedict of Nursia founded the original monastery around the year 529 on the site of an ancient pagan temple to Apollo. He had walked up that mountain as a young man seeking solitude, seeking God, seeking distance from a world that seemed to him to be fracturing at every joint. What he built there was modest at first, a community of monks committed to a life of prayer, work, and study. But the rule he wrote within those walls, the practical and deeply human guide to monastic life that bore his name, spread across the whole of Christian Europe with quiet, unstoppable force. Benedictine monasteries multiplied across the continent, each one a cell in a vast intellectual and spiritual network that held much of Western learning together through the centuries when so much else was falling apart. The library at Monte Cassino became one of the most important repositories of classical and religious manuscripts in the world. Monks there copied and preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost to history: Latin poetry, Greek philosophy, theological argument, medical knowledge, all of it protected by those thick walls and by the discipline of men who believed that preserving knowledge was itself a form of worship. To understand what stood on that mountain as 1944 began is to understand that the Allies were not simply looking at a fortified peak, they were looking at a monument to everything the war was supposed to be defending. The physical structure that dominated the mountaintop in the early months of 1944 was not the original 6th century construction. It was the product of centuries of expansion, damage, and rebuilding, most dramatically reconstructed after the earthquake of 1649 under the patronage of the papacy and the Italian nobility. What emerged over the following centuries was an immense Baroque complex. Enormous courtyards, broad cloisters, a great basilica with a richly decorated interior, library halls, and monastic quarters all assembled within an outer wall that, from a distance, gave the entire structure the look of a fortress. That appearance would prove fateful. The monastery's sheer scale and its commanding position at the summit of Monte Cassino meant that military minds, looking up from the valley, saw something that looked almost designed for military use, regardless of what it actually contained. The eye drew conclusions the intelligence reports had not yet confirmed. And in warfare, as in much else, perception has consequences. When the Benedictine monks who still inhabited the monastery became aware in the autumn of 1943 that the front lines of a world war were moving steadily toward their mountain, the abbot, a man of advanced years who had spent his life within those walls, faced choices that no amount of religious devotion could make easy. The monks were not alone. The monastery had become a refuge for local civilians, families from the town of Cassino below, from surrounding villages, from the open farmland of the Liri Valley, people who had fled the bombing of the towns and who now crowded into the ancient corridors and courtyards, seeking safety beneath the protection of the church and the informal shelter of the monastery's thick stone walls. There were also, stored within the building under arrangements made with German cultural authorities, a significant number of artworks, manuscripts, and valuables that had been transferred there from institutions in Naples and elsewhere for protection from Allied bombing. The German military had, at least initially, cooperated in treating the monastery as a protected cultural site. There were agreements, formal and informal, that the building would not be used for military purposes. The abbot believed those agreements. He had reason to. The German defensive posture around Monte Cassino, however, was built so thoroughly into the surrounding terrain that the distinction between the monastery itself and the military landscape immediately surrounding it was, to the soldiers doing the fighting and dying below, essentially invisible. German artillery positions, observation posts, troop concentrations, and supply routes were woven through the mountain in ways that used every feature of the ground. The town of Cassino at the mountain's base was fortified. The slopes were fortified. The ridgelines that connected Monte Cassino to the broader heights of the Colli Atretani were fortified. And at the very summit of all of this stood the white walls of a building that, whatever its legal and religious status, was the highest and clearest point on the entire front. Whether anyone was inside it with binoculars or not, it dominated everything below it. That dominance was, for the men trying to move up those slopes, almost beside the point. The mountain and the monastery that crowned it were one tactical problem, and every assault against German positions on the lower slopes felt the weight of that summit pressing down. Allied soldiers who survived those first weeks of fighting in the approaches to Cassino would later describe a particular sensation, that of being constantly watched. Every movement drew fire. Every approach was anticipated. Patrols that set out in the dark found themselves caught in illuminated killing grounds as though someone had known where they were going before they arrived. Whether that observation was being conducted from within the monastery walls, from positions near the walls, or simply from the network of fortified points that extended along the ridgeline beneath the monastery, mattered enormously to the historians who would later examine the record. To the soldiers in the moment, the distinction was academic. The mountain saw everything, and the monastery was the mountain's highest eye. This was the perception that began to harden into conviction among Allied field commanders as January of 1944 ground forward. Reports came in from frontline units describing what looked like signal activity from the monastery's direction. Artillery fell with a precision that seemed to imply adjusted observation. Requests moved up the chain of command. What was the monastery exactly? Was it being used? Could it be targeted? The answers that came back were inconclusive, and the inconclusiveness was itself maddening. The monastery existed in a kind of protected category that required certainty before action could be taken, and certainty was the one thing the fog and the fighting and the sheer physical difficulty of the terrain refused to provide. The question of the monastery was not simply a military question, and everyone involved understood that. The Vatican had expressed concern for the safety of the building. The international community, even in wartime, maintained a framework of cultural protection for religious and historic sites that had been laboriously constructed over decades. The monastery was not just any building. It was, in the estimation of almost every cultural and religious authority in the Western world, irreplaceable. To destroy it without absolute certainty of military necessity would be, the word that kept appearing in the conversations of those involved was catastrophic, and they meant it in multiple senses simultaneously. Catastrophic for the monks and civilians sheltering within, catastrophic for the Allied cause in terms of the propaganda consequences, catastrophic in the simple, irreversible sense of erasing something that had taken 14 centuries to build. And yet the men dying on the slopes below needed something to change. The Gustav Line was not simply holding, it was consuming the Allied advance, regiment by regiment, week by week, in a grinding expenditure of life that produced almost no forward movement. The monastery at the top of it all had become, in the minds of the soldiers and increasingly in the minds of their commanders, a symbol of everything that was wrong with this campaign. Whether it was militarily occupied almost didn't matter to the emotional logic of the situation. It was there, and it seemed impregnable, and it seemed to watch every attempt at progress with an ancient and pitiless patience that the armies below could not match. By the time February arrived, the debate had left the realm of pure military calculation and entered something harder to name. The monastery had become a question about what kind of war this was, about what the Allies were willing to destroy in order to win, and what they were not. For the commanders who gathered to discuss the bombing proposal, the ancient walls of Monte Cassino posed a problem that no amount of operational planning could fully resolve. How do you weigh a building that is simultaneously an obstacle, a symbol, a sanctuary, and a mystery? How do you decide, in the fog of a winter campaign in which men are dying every day without progress, whether to gamble on a piece of intelligence that cannot be confirmed and an action that cannot be undone? The monastery did not answer these questions. It simply stood where it had always stood, above the valley, above the fighting, above the reach of easy resolution, as it had stood through the Lombard invasions and the Saracen raids and the medieval earthquake and every other catastrophe that the centuries had produced. It had survived everything that history had thrown at it, and it sat now at the center of a question that 1944 would answer in fire and rubble. But before that answer came, there was still the long cold winter to endure, and the question itself, burning and unanswered, casting its shadow across every command post, every briefing room, every ridge and valley where cold and exhausted men lay in the mud and looked up at the white walls above them and wondered what, exactly, was watching from inside. There is a moment when you look at a map of the Italian peninsula from the autumn of 1943, where the geography itself seems to conspire against any army moving north. The boot of Italy narrows at precisely the wrong place, a choke point of mountain ranges, river valleys, and sheer rock faces that nature had already made nearly impassable before a single German engineer drove a single stake into the ground. It was into this terrain that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring looked and saw not a problem but a gift. He saw a place where a relatively small force, given enough time, enough concrete, and enough determination, could hold an entire Allied army in place for months, perhaps longer. The Gustav Line was the product of that vision, a defensive belt stretching from one coast of Italy to the other, roughly 140 kilometers south of Rome, running west to east across the peninsula's narrowest accessible corridor. Kesselring did not improvise this position. He planned it with the cold patience of a man who understood that space and time were the only resources Germany could still afford to spend freely. The western anchor of the line sat at the Tyrrhenian Sea, where the coastal lowlands quickly gave way to the first ridges of the Urunzi Mountains. From there, the line climbed and twisted eastward through a succession of peaks and valleys, crossing the Rapido River, cutting through the town of Cassino at the base of the great mountain, passing beneath the monastery itself on its commanding height, and then continuing across the spine of the Apennines toward the Sangro River on the Adriatic coast. The geography was not uniform along this stretch. It shifted, changed character, offered new obstacles at every turn, and Kesselring's engineers had studied each variation carefully, building their defenses to suit the ground rather than imposing a rigid pattern that the landscape would simply defeat. What emerged was less a line in the conventional military sense, and more a system of interlocking strongpoints, each one reinforcing its neighbors, each one designed to channel any attacker into the worst possible ground. The engineering work was extraordinary by any standard of the war. German construction units and their Italian labor forces had been working since the late summer of 1943, and by the time the first Allied patrols probed the outer edges of the position in early winter, what they found was staggering in its depth and sophistication. Bunkers had been cut directly into the living rock of the hillsides, their walls thick enough to absorb everything except a direct hit from the heaviest Allied ordnance. Machine gun positions were sited with fanatical care for interlocking fields of fire, each one covering the dead ground in front of the next, so that attacking infantry would find no safe angle of approach, no piece of shelter that was not already accounted for in someone's range card. Communication trenches connected position to position, allowing defenders to reinforce any threatened point without exposing themselves on the surface. It was warfare reduced to a kind of terrible geometry. Below the mountain and in the valleys, the German engineers turned the rivers themselves into weapons. The Rapido River, which flowed south through the Liri Valley just west of Cassino, was straightened and deepened in places, its banks cleared of vegetation so that any crossing attempt would be made in the open, fully exposed. The adjacent lowlands were flooded deliberately, turning fields and paths that Allied troops might otherwise have used into shallow lakes of freezing mud. The Sangro on the eastern end had its own natural ferocity in winter flood, and the Germans reinforced its natural difficulty with further obstacles and minefields laid in dense belts along the likely crossing points. Water, which had always been an obstacle in war, was now a weapon as deliberate and calculated as any gun emplacement. Kesselring intended that the first thing any Allied soldier would face before he ever reached a German rifle was the ground itself. The town of Cassino occupied a position of critical importance within this system. Sitting at the foot of the mountain in the floor of the Liri Valley, it controlled access to Route 6, the Via Casalina, the main road that ran north through the valley toward Rome. Whoever held Cassino held the key to that road, and Kesselring understood this perfectly. The town's stone buildings, already substantial and old, were reinforced and adapted. Cellars became fighting positions, upper floors became observation platforms, streets were blocked with rubble, arranged to create kill zones, narrow approaches where defending fire could concentrate on a predictable point of entry. The Heydrich Division's paratroopers, among the finest light infantry Germany possessed, were assigned to hold this sector. They were not simply placed there and told to wait. They were integrated into the position, allowed to study and improve it, and given the resources to make it as lethal as human ingenuity could manage. To the north and east of the town, the mountain rose sharply above the valley floor. Monte Cassino itself was not a single peak, but a massif, a complex of ridges, gullies, and false summits that grew more confusing the closer one approached. Point 556, Point 593, Hangman's Hill, Monte Villa. These were the names that would become grimly familiar in Allied operations orders over the months that followed. Each one a separate tactical problem, each one fortified in its own right. The Germans used the terrain with a practiced skill that spoke of careful reconnaissance and thorough planning. Artillery was pre-registered on every approach, every likely forming up point, every road junction and stream crossing that attacking troops might use. The defenders did not need to see their targets. They had already calculated where those targets would have to be, and the fire plans were ready. The eastern portion of the Gustav Line, where it crossed the Apennine highlands toward the Adriatic, was no less formidable in principle, though the terrain there was somewhat different in character. Here the mountains were broader, the valleys less defined, and the defensive problem was one of covering enormous distances of high ground rather than controlling a single critical valley. The German dispositions stretched accordingly, thinner across the ridgelines, but always anchored on the key observation points and road junctions that controlled movement in either direction. Reinforcement could flow between sectors more easily than the Allies appreciated, and Kesselring maintained reserves that could be shuttled by road behind the line, with a speed that repeatedly surprised Allied commanders who thought they had identified a weak point. Behind the Gustav Line itself, Kesselring had prepared additional defensive positions further north. The Hitler Line, later renamed the Senger Line, partly to distance it from association with a name that was growing less strategically valuable, waited a short distance up the Liri Valley as a fallback position if the Gustav Line were ever penetrated. Beyond that, the Caesar Line covered the approaches to Rome itself. The Allies would not learn of the full depth of these preparations immediately, and the knowledge, when it became clear, only deepened the sense of what they were being asked to accomplish. Breaking through the Gustav Line would not end the campaign. It would only begin the next phase of it. Kesselring had designed a position not just to stop an army but to bleed it, slow it, and grind it down across multiple defensive belts stretched across months of fighting. Supply and logistics underpinned everything. The German defenders on Monte Cassino and in the surrounding heights faced one of the most challenging supply problems of the Italian campaign. Mules carried ammunition and rations up tracks that no vehicle could negotiate, and even that effort was dangerous and exhausting. German quartermasters developed resupply systems that moved primarily at night, using the cover of darkness and the dead ground in the mountain's folds to evade Allied observation. The defenders endured appalling conditions, cold, wet, short of sleep, under constant artillery fire in their positions, but they were fed and armed with a regularity that spoke well of the logistical organization behind them. A defensive line is only as strong as the system that sustains it, and Kesselring had thought carefully about that system as well. What the Allied commanders confronted, then, in the winter of 1943 going into 1944, was something that had no real precedent in the Western Allied experience of the war up to that point. The beaches and hedgerows of North Africa and Sicily had been difficult. The climb up the Italian boot from Reggio had been exhausting and costly. But the Gustav Line was something different in kind. Not merely a defensive position, but an entire engineered environment. A landscape reshaped by calculation and labor into a machine for killing attackers. There was no obvious flank to turn. The sea blocked any wide envelopment to the west, and the Apennines made any deep flanking move through the mountains almost logistically impossible in winter conditions. The line had to be broken, and it had to be broken roughly where Kesselring had already anticipated it would be tried. It is worth pausing on the confidence that this implied. Kesselring knew the Allies would come at him across the Rapido, up the Liri Valley, against Cassino and the mountain above it. He had built the Gustav Line precisely to receive that attack, to absorb it, punish it, and send it back in tatters. He was not gambling or guessing. He was working from a reading of the ground that any competent staff officer could reproduce, because the geography left so few alternatives. The Allied commanders were not blind to this. They could read a map as well as any German general. They understood, at the operational level, that they were being asked to fight on ground chosen by their enemy, against defenses prepared specifically to defeat them, with the mountain looming over everything as both a physical obstacle and an observation post of incomparable value. The men who would carry out the assault understood it too, in the simpler and more immediate terms of soldiers who look at a hill and know what it is going to cost to climb it under fire. Both kinds of understanding, the generals and the soldiers, would be tested in the months that lay ahead. By the winter of 1943, the Allied command structure in Italy was a thing of competing personalities, competing visions, and competing national pride. The war had already produced its legends, men whose names filled newspaper columns and whose photographs hung in mess halls from London to Louisiana. But legend, as any soldier on the line could tell you, did not move mountains. What was needed now was not fame but function, not glory but the grinding, methodical application of force against one of the most formidable defensive systems the German military mind had ever constructed. The commanders gathering in the shroud of Monte Cassino were capable men, sometimes brilliant men. They were also deeply human, ambitious, proud, occasionally blinkered by the weight of their own reputations. Understanding what happened at Cassino means understanding who these men were, what they believed, and why they so often struggled to agree. General Sir Bernard Montgomery left Italy in late 1943, recalled to England to take command of ground forces for the coming invasion of northwestern Europe. His departure was a seismic event in the campaign. Montgomery was, whatever else one might say about him, a force of character, a man who imposed his personality on every operation he touched, who demanded meticulous preparation, and who communicated with his troops in a language they understood. He had led the Eighth Army across the Western Desert, through Sicily, and into the Italian mainland, and the formation bore his imprint deeply. Soldiers who served under him tended to develop strong opinions about him, either fierce loyalty or quiet frustration, rarely indifference. When he left, he took with him something harder to define than tactical skill, a particular sense of institutional momentum, a feeling that the machine knew its master's hand. Into his place stepped General Sir Oliver Leese, a tall, powerfully built man whose manner was considerably warmer than his predecessors, though no less committed to the British way of making war. Lise had served under Montgomery in the desert and had absorbed much of his approach: careful preparation, strong logistical foundation, a preference for set-piece battle over improvisation. He was respected by the men who served beneath him, known for making time to move among the soldiers rather than remaining fixed at a distant headquarters. Yet taking command of an army already bled by months of Italian fighting, an army that had grown accustomed to one man's way of doing things, was not a straightforward inheritance. Lise understood that the Eighth Army needed continuity even as it adjusted to new leadership, and he worked deliberately to project calm authority during a period when the campaign offered very little calm to speak of. To the west, commanding the Fifth Army, stood an American general of a very different type. General Mark Clark was 47 years old, lean and angular, with a face that the cameras seemed to find naturally compelling, a fact that Clark himself was perhaps not entirely unaware of. He had risen rapidly through the ranks, driven by ambition and genuine operational ability in roughly equal measure. Clark was a man who felt the weight of history pressing on him personally, who understood that the eyes of the United States were on the Italian campaign, and by extension on him. He wanted Rome. He wanted it with an intensity that sometimes colored his military judgment, that made him willing to accept costs that a more dispassionate commander might have avoided. His relationship with the press was carefully cultivated, his sense of personal destiny rarely far from his thinking. The relationship between Clark and Lise, and more broadly between the American and British commands, was shaped by something that ran beneath the surface of every joint planning session and every politely worded memorandum. These were allies bound by genuine common cause, by shared sacrifice, and by the practical necessities of coalition warfare. They were also representatives of two nations with different military traditions, different institutional cultures, and different ideas about what good generalship looked like. The British approach to the Italian campaign tended toward the methodical, building up strength, securing flanks, moving forward in carefully choreographed stages. The Americans, at least in the popular self-image that Clark embodied, favored speed, drive, the aggressive exploitation of opportunity. Neither instinct was wrong in itself. The trouble arose when both instincts had to inhabit the same campaign simultaneously. Above both men sat the Allied commander in the Mediterranean theatre, General Sir Harold Alexander, who bore the considerable burden of managing this coalition without allowing its internal tensions to fracture it entirely. Alexander was a diplomat in uniform, charming, tactful, sometimes frustratingly vague in his direction of subordinates, but possessed of a genuine talent for keeping powerful egos functioning within a single structure. He had served in both world wars, had survived Dunkirk, had commanded in North Africa alongside both Montgomery and American generals, and had developed a feel for the dangerous currents that ran through alliance politics. His role at Cassino was not simply to plan attacks, but to hold together an arrangement of forces that included British, American, Canadian, New Zealand, Indian, French, and Polish formations, each with its own chain of command, its own national sensitivities, and its own view of how the battle ought to be fought. The strategic disagreement between the American and British approaches crystallized sharply over the question of how to break the Gustav Line. The Fifth Army, fighting on the western side of the Italian peninsula, faced the most direct route toward Rome, the Highway 6 corridor running through the Liri Valley, with Monte Cassino dominating the entire approach from its great height. Clark's instinct, reinforced by pressure from Washington and by his own desire to reach the Italian capital, was to find a way through this corridor as quickly as possible. The British formations under Lise, operating on the Eighth Army's sector, brought a different calculation, that rushing forward without adequate preparation against Kesselring's fortifications was not boldness but waste, and that the ground itself was an enemy as punishing as any German division. There was also the matter of the terrain, which imposed its own brutal logic on whatever the commanders preferred to believe. The Rapido River ran across the approach to the Liri Valley, cold and swift, and offering almost no cover for crossing infantry. Behind it, the mountains rose in successive ridges, each one a prepared defensive position, each one requiring its own assault, its own accumulation of casualties, its own week or more of grinding effort before the next ridge came into view. The commanders poring over maps in dry headquarters could read these features as lines on paper. The soldiers who would have to cross them experienced them as something categorically different, as walls of mud and fire and German machine gun fire that made every meter of progress a calculated expenditure of lives. General Clark's Fifth Army had already been feeling this reality since the autumn, the crossing of the Volturno River, the battles through the mountains north of Naples. These had given his American formations a harsh education in Italian winter warfare. The 36th Infantry Division and the 363rd Infantry Regiment, among others, had fought in conditions that bore little resemblance to the fluid, fast-moving campaign that some had imagined when Italy first entered the Allied sights. By the time the Gustav Line loomed ahead, the Fifth Army was an institution that knew what it was facing, even if its commander's public posture radiated determination rather than doubt. Planning sessions for the assault on Cassino unfolded with this undercurrent of sober experience running beneath the language of operational confidence. The friction between approaches also extended to the use of air power, artillery, and the sequencing of attacks. Allied air forces in the Mediterranean had grown enormously powerful by the opening months of 1944, and questions about how to deploy that power, whether to focus on interdiction of German supply lines, direct support of ground troops, or the increasingly controversial question of the monastery itself, ran through planning discussions at every level. Artillery resources were considerable but not unlimited, and the allocation of heavy guns between the Fifth Army's western sector and the Eighth Army's operations required constant negotiation. These were not trivial bureaucratic disputes. In a campaign defined by small margins, the difference between adequate fire support and inadequate fire support could mean the difference between a bridgehead held and one lost. What all of these commanders shared, whatever their disagreements, was the knowledge that failure was not an abstraction. The strategic promise of the Italian campaign, that it would draw German divisions away from northwestern Europe, that it would provide a route toward the heart of the Reich, that it would justify the enormous investment in men and materiel already committed, depended on actually breaking through. The Gustav Line standing intact was not merely a military embarrassment. It was a strategic crisis that reverberated from the headquarters in Caserta all the way to the planning rooms in London and Washington, where the fate of the entire European war was being argued. The commanders assembling around Monte Cassino in late winter and early spring of 1944 understood this weight. They carried it differently, expressed it differently, managed it with different personalities and different national styles, but none of them could set it down. And so the stage was set for what would become one of the most protracted and costly engagements in the entire Italian theatre. The men who would make the decisions, Clark and Leese, Alexander presiding over both, with their corps and division commanders below them, were capable of great things and subject to great pressures. They would argue, defer, occasionally outmaneuver one another politically, and sometimes make choices that history has since regarded with harsh clarity. They would also demonstrate, in the months ahead, a persistence that is difficult to explain purely in terms of military calculation. Something else drove them forward against a mountain that refused to fall, the slow, grinding conviction that the thing simply had to be done, whatever it cost, whoever gave the order, whatever the consequences for reputation or record. The mountain would not move, so the commanders would have to find a way to climb it, each in his own fashion, with all the friction and all the determination that coalition warfare could produce. The mountains did not care who crossed them. They had broken armies before, Roman, Byzantine, Norman, and now, in the bitter January of 1944, they would test yet another generation of soldiers who had come believing, perhaps naively, that momentum and courage alone might be enough. The Allied command had looked at the map and seen an opportunity. If forces could push across the Rapido River and swing north and east behind Monte Cassino, they might sever the German supply lines feeding the Gustav Line and force a withdrawal without ever having to storm the monastery heights directly. It was the kind of plan that made sense in a dry, warm room far from the mud. On the ground, in the cold, in the dark, it was something else entirely. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army held the western approach, and the plan required multiple simultaneous thrusts, a pincer logic that assumed the parts would move in coordination, that the river would be crossable, that the weather would cooperate, that the ground would permit the kind of speed the maps implied was possible. None of those assumptions held. The Rapido River, swollen with winter rain and snowmelt draining from the peaks above Cassino, ran fast and cold and dark through a valley that the Germans had spent months turning into a killing ground. The approaches to the river crossing points had been flooded deliberately, mined carefully, and zeroed in by German artillery registered on every logical approach. The soldiers carrying assault boats toward the water found themselves moving through mud that swallowed boots whole, through fields sown with mines that made each step a wager, under the kind of cold that stiffened fingers and clouded breath, and made the simple act of thinking clearly an effort all its own. The Texas Division, the 36th Infantry Division, carrying with it a fierce regional pride and the expectation of its own men that it would perform, was tasked with crossing the Rapido near the town of Sant'Angelo. The crossing attempts in mid-January cost the division more men in 2 days than many units lose in an entire campaign. Boats were hit before they reached the far bank. Units that did cross found themselves isolated on the opposite shore, without the support that was supposed to follow, cut off by fire that had found the crossing points with devastating accuracy. Men pinned in the reeds at the water's edge, men who had made it across and could neither advance nor retreat. The Rapido became, in the memory of those who survived it, not a river but a verdict, a cold and indifferent judgment on the gap between what a plan promises and what the earth delivers. At the same time, to the north, Allied forces probed the heights around the monastery from a different direction. The logic of the wider campaign demanded movement across multiple axes, and so while the Rapido crossing ground to a catastrophe, other units were climbing. The terrain north of Cassino offered a route that theoretically flanked the strongest German positions. Theoretically. In practice, the slopes were steep enough to make mules struggle, narrow enough to reduce a column of men to a single file, and exposed enough that any movement visible from the heights above drew immediate fire. The German defenders knew every fold and gully. They had spent months learning this ground as intimately as any soldier learns ground he knows he must defend or die defending. American infantry from the 34th Division pushed into the hills north and west of the monastery with a grim persistence that no single day's failure could extinguish. They took positions on ridges, were driven from them, took them again, They crept across ground that offered no cover and little enough concealment, moving by night when the cold became a second enemy layered on top of the first. Supply lines up the mountain ran through routes so difficult that ammunition and rations had to be hand-carried by men who were already exhausted from simply existing at that altitude in those conditions. Hot food was a rumor. Sleep was rationed in minutes rather than hours. The fighting had a quality less like battle and more like sustained collective suffering, interrupted at intervals by violence. What made the German defense so effective was not simply its firepower, though that was considerable. The paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division who held the casino sector were among the most capable soldiers in the German order of battle. Experienced, disciplined, and utterly committed to a defense they understood would cost the Allies enormously. They had used their months of preparation well. Defensive positions were constructed into the rock itself, concrete reinforced where the ground permitted, blasted directly from cliff faces where it did not. Machine gun positions covered each other in overlapping arcs. Mortar teams had pre-registered targets across every approach. An Allied unit moving up a slope might walk for an hour under nothing, and then, in the space of a few seconds, find itself under fire from 3 directions simultaneously, with no clear picture of where any of it was coming from. The weather deepened every hardship. January 1944 was brutal across the Italian interior. Rain fell for days at a stretch, turning the already difficult mountain tracks into channels of mud and loose stone that could not support wheeled vehicles and barely supported the men who walked them. When the rain paused, temperatures dropped sharply enough to glaze the mud with frost by morning. Aircraft that might have provided close air support were grounded for stretches of days. Artillery coordination suffered when observation posts could see nothing through low cloud. The Allies were not simply fighting the Germans. They were fighting the mountain, the river, the rain, the mud, and the cold all at once. And all of those fights were happening simultaneously, with no respite between them. New Zealand forces under General Bernard Freyberg were committed to the casino sector during this period, adding weight and hard-won experience from campaigns in North Africa and the Pacific. Freyberg himself was a decorated and formidable commander, and his New Zealanders were not troops who broke easily. But even their quality could not override the fundamental arithmetic of attacking prepared positions across terrain that negated every advantage the attacker might bring. When a company of experienced infantry is climbing a slope toward concealed positions, when every step risks a mine, when artillery support cannot always see what it is meant to hit, when the path forward is a rock face and the path back is a rock face, experience becomes simply the knowledge that you are in a situation with very few good options. Gains were made. It is important to say that, because the story of January is not one of pure stasis. The 34th Division, through fighting that their own officers would later describe in terms that struggled to find adequate language, worked its way onto the ridgelines north of Monte Cassino and came closer to the monastery than any Allied force had yet reached. Patrols pushed to within sight of the walls. Small units established positions on ground that had seemed unreachable. At points, German commanders on the mountain felt genuine pressure, genuine concern that the line might fracture if the pressure continued at the same pace. The Allies were not failing to make contact. They were making contact constantly, at great cost, and each contact extracted a toll from both sides. But the breakthrough did not come. The weight of losses, the condition of the troops, the impossibility of sustaining the supply of ammunition and material up those slopes at a rate that could keep pace with the rate of expenditure in combat, all of it accumulated against progress. By the time January exhausted itself, the Allies held new ground on the heights north of Cassino. but they had not broken the German line. The monastery above them was still German-held ground, still impervious, still the commanding height from which everything below could be observed and engaged. The weeks of fighting had shifted the front in some places by hundreds of meters. Against what it had cost, that arithmetic sat heavily. Back at the crossing sites on the Rapido, the failure carried a particular bitterness. Survivors of the crossing attempts would carry what happened there for the rest of their lives. The chaos, the dead in the water, the isolation on the far bank. After the war, veterans of the 36th Division formally called for a congressional investigation into the conduct of the Rapido River operation, an unusual step that spoke to the depth of feeling about how those days had unfolded. General Clark maintained to his end that the crossing had been necessary, that it had drawn German forces away from other sectors, that it had served a larger operational purpose. The men who had crossed the river, or had tried to, were not always persuaded by that accounting. Memory and military logic do not always resolve themselves into agreement. What January had taught, though its lessons were bought at a price that still defies easy summary, was the nature of what the Allies were actually facing. This was not a position that could be flanked cheaply, or bypassed cleverly, or overwhelmed quickly. The Gustav Line at Cassino was a defense designed by experienced soldiers with months of preparation behind them, anchored on terrain that amplified every advantage the defender held and stripped every advantage from the attacker. The commanders looking at the maps in February understood something they had perhaps understood theoretically in December, but now understood in a different way, in the way that only weeks of fighting in cold mountains teaches. If Monte Cassino was to fall, it would not fall easily, and the reckoning with what to do about the monastery that stood on its summit was coming whether they sought it or not. The mountain was still there, the Germans were still on it, and the question that would define the next months of the campaign had not yet been asked aloud in the way it was about to be. The winter cold settled over the Rapido Valley like a verdict. Below the monastery, men scraped frost from their rifles each morning and watched the same stone walls they had been watching for weeks. The advance had stalled. The casualties kept arriving, and high above it all, the ancient structure of Monte Cassino gazed down from its ridge with the impassive patience of something that had already outlasted empires. For the soldiers pinned in the mud below, that gaze began to feel less like the indifference of stone and more like something deliberate. The question that started as a whisper in foxholes worked its way upward through the chain of command until it was sitting in briefing rooms and appearing in formal intelligence assessments. Was the monastery being used? Was it watching them the way they imagined? It was, in a precise military sense, a perfect observation point. The ridge on which the Benedictine monastery sat offered a commanding view of virtually every approach route the Allies could use. The Liri Valley below, the road north, the river crossings, the assembly areas where men and vehicles gathered before an assault, all of it lay open to anyone standing at those ancient windows. German artillery coordination in this sector had been disturbingly accurate. Shells found ranges that seemed too precise to be guesswork. Infantry movements that should have been concealed were met with fire that came quickly and landed well. Allied artillery officers, men who understood the geometry of observation and trajectory, began working backward from the patterns of German fire and pointing their calculations toward the heights. The monastery sat at the apex of every line they drew. Intelligence reports began filtering through in late January of 1944, accumulating details that were individually inconclusive but collectively unsettling. A senior New Zealand officer compiled witness accounts from soldiers and airmen who believed they had seen flashes of light from within the monastery walls, signals, or so it seemed, coordinating with artillery bursts below. A report from a captured German soldier, interpreted through translation and the fog of interrogation, appeared to suggest that German units were using the monastery in some capacity. An aerial photograph, studied and restudied by analysts, showed what might have been radio antenna wire running near the outer walls, or might have been something else entirely. The uncertainties piled up like the rubble already accumulating in the town below. No single piece of evidence was decisive. Together, they formed a picture that men under pressure found easy to believe. The debate that followed was not a clean exchange of views between calm strategists. It was an argument driven by exhaustion, grief, and the accumulated frustration of weeks of failure. Commanders who had watched good men die on those slopes were being asked to operate under a constraint that seemed, from where they stood in the mud, increasingly abstract. The monastery's protected status had been agreed upon early in the Italian campaign. The Allies had formally pledged not to use it as a military position, and by official German assurance, neither would they. But assurances issued in autumn looked different by February, after the ground had been soaked in blood. The men arguing to protect the monastery were not arguing from ignorance of the cost. They were arguing from a different set of priorities, and that difference was precisely what made the debate so corrosive. On one side stood those who believed that military necessity had simply overridden every other consideration. They argued that no defensive advantage the Germans possessed should be allowed to stand if the Allies had the means to remove it. The monastery, whether or not it was literally occupied by soldiers, provided an anchor for German morale, a reference point for their entire defensive system in this sector, and a psychological fortress that discouraged Allied assault. Its destruction, they argued, would be a practical and a symbolic blow simultaneously. Leaving it standing while men died in its shadow was not, they contended, a form of moral purity. It was a form of moral failure dressed in religious sentiment. The argument had force. It had the force that only mounting casualty lists can give an argument. On the other side stood voices that carried their own kind of authority. There were intelligence officers who had studied the available evidence with greater care and were not convinced. They noted that the Germans had, by credible accounts, actually gone to considerable lengths to keep their forces away from the monastery itself, moving supplies and personnel around it rather than through it. The Vatican had been communicating through diplomatic channels, and the abbot of Monte Cassino had himself sent word that German troops were not inside the walls. These were not trivial voices. The abbot was present, he was observing, and he was saying that the fears were unfounded. Discounting him required a willingness to believe that the evidence supporting German occupation was stronger than the testimony of the man who was actually living inside the building in question. The argument also carried a cultural and historical weight that some commanders felt acutely and others barely registered. Monte Cassino was not simply an old building. It was the house that Benedict of Nursia had built in the 6th century, the cradle of Western monasticism, a place where manuscripts had been copied and preserved through centuries of plague, invasion, and collapse. It had been damaged before, and rebuilt before, but its significance to the Catholic world, and through the Catholic world to the broader concept of European civilization that the Allies nominally represented, was immeasurable. Destroying it would send a signal, not just to the German propaganda apparatus, which would exploit every photograph of rubble, but to the populations of occupied countries watching to see whether the liberators understood what liberation was supposed to mean. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied ground forces in Italy, received the assessments and felt the full weight of the contradiction. His commanders in the field were expressing, with increasing urgency, their belief that the monastery was being used against them. His intelligence staff was producing reports that supported this belief, even if those reports were built on observation and inference rather than confirmed fact. The men doing the dying had no patience left for philosophical debate about the standards of evidence required before a military target could be struck. Alexander understood the pressure from below. He also understood what striking the monastery without certainty would mean. He escalated the question upward. The debate reached levels of command where the consideration was not only military, but political. General Mark Clark held a view that he would later articulate clearly in memoir and testimony, though the clarity of retrospect is always different from the difficulty of the decision made in the moment. Clark was not enthusiastic about the bombing. He believed, based on the intelligence available to him at the time, that the evidence of German occupation of the monastery itself was not conclusively established. He worried that destroying it would produce rubble that defenders could use more effectively than standing walls. He worried about the propaganda consequences. But he was also a commander whose army was bleeding in front of an unbroken line, and he operated in a command structure where the views of subordinate commanders carried moral weight that was difficult to resist. The pressure on him was enormous, and it came from men he respected. The New Zealand Corps commander, General Bernard Freyberg, became the most forceful advocate for destruction. Freyberg was a decorated soldier of enormous standing, a man whose physical courage was legendary and whose concern for his troops was genuine. He pressed the case for bombing with the conviction of a soldier who had watched too many assaults fail against what he believed was a fortified observation post. His formal request for the bombing went up the chain of command with the authority of his name behind it, and his name meant something. When Freyberg said that his troops could not advance while the monastery stood intact above them, he was not speaking carelessly. He was speaking from the accumulated grief of everything he had witnessed on those slopes. His argument was felt as much as it was heard. What made the debate so painful, in retrospect and perhaps at the time, was the deep uncertainty at its heart. The men arguing most passionately for the bombing were not lying. They genuinely believed the monastery was being used. The intelligence reports they had received, filtered through the distortions that fear and frustration and wishful pattern-making can introduce into any information system, appeared to support that belief. And the men arguing against the bombing were also not lying. They also were working from the available evidence and reaching different conclusions. There was no clean villain in the debate and no obvious hero. There was only the pressure of a war that was eating men alive on a frozen hillside, and a building on a ridge that had survived 1,000 years and was now caught at the intersection of two incompatible necessities. By the first days of February 1944, the internal argument was narrowing toward resolution. The weight of military opinion, driven by Freyberg's formal request and supported by the reports from the field, was moving in one direction. The counter-arguments had not been defeated in any logical sense. They had simply been overwhelmed by the momentum of a military machine that needed to do something, and had identified what that something was. The bombing of the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino was moving from debate to decision, from anguished question to operational order. The ancient building on the ridge had 1,400 years of history behind it. It had, without knowing it, only days left standing. The winter of 1944 brought more than cold rain to the mountains of southern Italy. It brought a crisis of conscience to the highest levels of Allied command. General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, stood at the center of a question that would echo through military history and theology alike. The question was simple on its surface, but impossible in its implications. Should the Allies bomb the Monastery of Monte Cassino? The answer would not be simple at all. For weeks, intelligence officers had compiled reports suggesting German forces used the monastery as an observation post and artillery coordinator. Yet the certainty of bombing was absolute, while the certainty of German occupation remained elusive. This was the fundamental paradox that General Clark and his commanders had to navigate in those grey February days. The military argument for bombing rested on logic that seemed unassailable to officers staring at maps showing the stalled campaign. The monastery sat atop the mountain like a crown jewel of observation. From its height, German artillery spotters could direct fire across the entire Liri Valley and see the approach routes of any Allied assault long before troops could cross the exposed ground below. Kesselring's engineers had built the Gustav Line with this monastery in mind. Whether or not German soldiers actually slept within its walls, the structure's existence gave German defenders an advantage. Every American general who looked at the problem reached similar conclusions. The monks had been evacuated or were harboring German troops. Intelligence was murky on this point. What seemed clear was that the building itself, standing like a sentinel above the battlefield, functioned as a German asset, whether intentionally or not. The military logic was that removing it would remove a German advantage. To officers who had already lost thousands of men in failed assaults against this position, that logic held tremendous weight. Yet something more complicated was stirring in the minds of commanders who understood what they were considering. The Monastery of Monte Cassino was not a munitions factory or a military installation. It was a structure of extraordinary historical and spiritual significance that had endured for 14 centuries. Saint Benedict himself had founded the community around 920 AD, and the monastery had become one of the greatest repositories of learning and faith in all of Christian Europe through the Middle Ages. Books preserved within its walls had saved works of classical antiquity that would otherwise have been lost forever. The building itself was a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture, a proof of generations of monks who had devoted their lives to God and to preserving knowledge. Beyond the walls lived monks who had no say in the war and no role in its prosecution. And somewhere in the monastery, reports suggested, were Italian civilians who had taken refuge there, families fleeing the violence below, seeking sanctuary in a place that had been sanctuary for 1,000 years. The debate over bombing the monastery did not remain confined to officers in the field. It escalated rapidly through chains of command and across Allied governments. Religious leaders in Britain and America learned that such a bombing was being considered and began to voice their concerns publicly and in private communications with government officials. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself raised questions about whether the monastery was truly being used as a German strongpoint or whether bombing would constitute a grave violation of Christian ethics and international law. Newspapers began to carry stories about the monastery's potential destruction. Public opinion, particularly in Catholic nations like Poland and Ireland, mobilized against the bombing. Yet these moral objections met resistance from military men who felt that sentiment should not override tactical necessity. General Clark received reports from his intelligence officers stating with considerable confidence that the Germans were using the monastery for observation purposes. Some reports claimed German paratroopers were actually stationed within the monastery itself, though these claims would later prove to be unfounded. The pressure from both directions, military necessity and moral conscience, created an impossible situation for commanders who had to make the decision. What made the situation even more complicated was the genuine uncertainty at the heart of the intelligence assessments. Allied commanders did not have perfect information about whether German forces actually occupied the monastery or merely used its location for observation. Intelligence gathered from captured prisoners, aerial photography, and informants pointed in different directions. Some evidence suggested Germans were inside the structure. Other evidence suggested they were nearby, but not actually within the monastery walls. The chain of command struggled with this ambiguity. General Harold Alexander, commander of the entire Mediterranean theatre, initially opposed bombing the monastery. He believed it was neither militarily necessary nor morally defensible. But as pressure mounted from Clark's Fifth Army, and as casualty figures continued to climb without progress, Alexander's resistance began to weaken. The grinding nature of the campaign wore down moral objections like water wearing down stone. Commanders became increasingly frustrated with their inability to break through a defensive line that seemed to hold all the advantages. Each failed assault seemed to reinforce the conviction that something radical had to be done. The monastery became a focal point for all this frustration, a visible symbol of German advantage that could be removed with certainty, even if the military benefit remained uncertain. General Clark ultimately made the decision that would define his entire command and haunt him for the rest of his life. He approved the bombing. The reasoning he recorded was straightforward. The monastery was being used by the Germans, and removing it was necessary for military success. Yet his own writings and statements both during and after the war revealed doubt beneath the surface of that decision. Clark understood he was ordering the destruction of a place of profound historical and spiritual importance. He understood that monks and civilians would die. He understood that the decision was controversial and that history would judge him for it. But standing in the position of a commander responsible for the lives of thousands of his own soldiers, facing a stalemate that seemed unbreakable, he felt the decision could not be avoided. The bombing was scheduled for the 15th of February. The date was set. The bombers were being readied. The machinery of destruction was being put in motion, and there seemed to be no force strong enough to stop it. What made this decision even more consequential was that it would prove militarily counterproductive in ways that Clark could not have foreseen. The destroyed monastery would provide German paratroopers with even better defensive positions than the standing structure. Rubble and craters create natural strongpoints that trained soldiers can turn into formidable fortifications. The bombing would kill an estimated 200 people, but would fail to remove the German advantage that Clark sought to eliminate. In fact, it would intensify that advantage. Yet Clark could not see this future consequence from his command post in February 1944. He could only see a grinding war that had to be broken through, and a monastery that seemed to stand in the way. The decision was made in conditions of incomplete information and under pressure that wore down the usual constraints of conscience. This is how many of the most consequential decisions in war are made. Not through careful deliberation in perfect clarity, but through the grinding pressure of circumstances that force commanders to act despite their doubts. The decision to bomb the monastery revealed something fundamental about the nature of warfare at the strategic level. War does not offer commanders the luxury of perfect choices between clear goods and clear evils. Instead, it forces them to choose between different kinds of harm, different kinds of cost, different kinds of failure. Clark could choose to preserve the monastery and accept continued casualties among his own troops as they faced a seemingly impregnable defensive line. Or he could choose to destroy the monastery and accept the moral weight of destroying a historic and sacred place while hoping for military advantage. There was no third choice that avoided harm altogether. This is what separates the actual experience of command in war from the ways that wars are often discussed in civilian life. Commanders do not get to choose between fighting and preserving the innocent. They choose between different ways of fighting and different distributions of harm. Some of that harm falls on soldiers under their command. Some falls on civilians. some falls on cultural heritage. The calculation is never purely military, because soldiers are people and monks are people, and history is something that humans carry forward together. Yet the calculation cannot be purely moral either, because commanders bear responsibility for the soldiers they command. The weeks leading up to the bombing saw increasing intensity in the debate among Allied leaders. General Clark's chief of staff, Major General Alfred Gruenter, processed the military arguments and presented them to Clark in their most compelling form. The arguments about German observation posts and artillery coordination were repeated and reinforced. Yet Gruenter also understood the moral objections and the historical significance of what was being considered. The decision moved through channels of command where it was endorsed at higher levels. Admiral Sir John Cunningham, the senior Allied naval commander in the Mediterranean, was consulted and expressed his concerns about the bombing. Yet he did not ultimately block it. Prime Minister Winston Churchill in London was aware of the decision and did not intervene to prevent it, though records suggest he had reservations. The decision gathered momentum through the weight of military argument and the frustration of a campaign that seemed stuck in place. Once Clark had approved the bombing and higher command had endorsed it, the machinery moved forward with the inevitability of an avalanche. Orders were issued. Bomber squadrons were briefed. Intelligence maps were prepared. The date of the 15th of February was locked in. The monastery's fate was sealed. What few at the time could fully grasp was how this decision would ripple far beyond the immediate military question of whether the monastery itself was being used as a German strongpoint. The bombing would become a symbol in the minds of people across Europe and beyond. A symbol of the way that war devoured everything in its path, even those things that were supposed to be sacred and preserved. Catholic populations in Poland and Ireland and Italy would view the bombing as a desecration, as evidence that even the Allies were capable of destroying what was holy in their pursuit of victory. German propagandists would seize upon the bombing and use it to argue that the Allies were not the defenders of Christian civilization they claimed to be. The moral authority that the Allies had carefully constructed would take a blow from which it would never entirely recover in the minds of many. And the military benefit, the reason for all of this, would prove to be minimal at best, non-existent at worst. The rubble of the monastery would serve German defenders better than the standing structure. The breakthrough that Clark hoped the bombing would enable would not come as a result of destroying the monastery. It would come weeks later, after the Polish Second Corps had been brought in, and after the campaign had been fundamentally reorganized. All of this lay in the future, on those February days when the decision was made. As the 15th of February approached, the monastery stood in the mountains, unaware of what the next dawn would bring. Inside the walls, monks prayed for peace as they had for centuries. Outside the walls, soldiers from a dozen nations prepared for battle. Above them all, the machinery of an industrial war was being positioned and readied. The decision had been made, not with enthusiasm but with grim acceptance of what seemed necessary. The question of whether the monastery was actually being used as a German strongpoint remained unanswered, and would remain unanswered until it was too late. The moral debate would continue, but it would continue as historical analysis, not as a factor that could affect the decision. The bombing was coming. The monastery's fate had been determined in the offices of generals who bore the weight of commands and the responsibility for soldiers who were dying. This is where the abstract question of military necessity meets the concrete reality of destruction. And this is where one of the most significant decisions of the entire campaign would be made, not in triumph or clarity, but in doubt and urgency and the grinding pressure of incomplete choices. The decision had been made in the smoke-filled rooms of command posts and headquarters, whispered through cables, and relayed in careful military language, designed to sanitize what was about to happen. General Mark Clark had authorized the bombing. The wheels were in motion, and on the morning of the 15th of February 1944, as dawn broke over the Italian countryside and mist clung to the valleys below, the sky itself would become an instrument of war. The monastery's bells would ring for the last time. What had stood for 14 centuries, what had survived barbarian invasions and earthquakes and the collapse of empires, would fall in a matter of hours to American bombing. The operation was codenamed Avenger, though there was nothing of divine retribution about what was about to unfold, only the grinding logic of military necessity colliding with the weight of history. The bomber stream assembled in the cold morning air like a dark cloud gathering strength. 254 American B-17 Fortresses and B-26 Marauders formed up in their squadrons, their contrails etching white lines across the Mediterranean sky. The pilots knew their target. The intelligence briefings had been explicit. Monte Cassino Monastery. The monks had been given warning. Official channels had suggested they evacuate, though the suggestion came late and with uncertainties that prevented any orderly departure. Some had fled into the surrounding hills. Others remained, believing that their sanctuary, a place of prayer and learning for centuries, would somehow be spared the machinery of modern war. Perhaps they trusted in God. Perhaps they had nowhere else to go. The bombs were loaded into the belly of each aircraft, not just high-explosive ordnance, but napalm and phosphorus as well, a devastating mix designed to level everything on the mountain. The bombardiers checked their instruments. The radio operators tested their frequencies. Everything moved with the precision of American industrial war production. The transformation of young men and machines into pure destructive capacity. The target itself seemed almost fragile in comparison. A collection of stone buildings clinging to the peak of a mountain. The monastery's walls and cloisters, its library and scriptorium, its bell towers and refectories had absorbed 1,400 years of European history. Monks had copied manuscripts by candlelight in those rooms. Pilgrims had walked those corridors seeking solace and knowledge. The structure represented something precious to the Western world, a repository of learning that had survived the Dark Ages itself, a physical manifestation of continuity and faith across the centuries. And yet, from the perspective of the American bombardiers flying at 20,000 feet, looking through their bomb sights at the coordinates provided by intelligence, the monastery was simply a grid reference, a military objective, a potential enemy observation post that needed to be erased. The human mind has a capacity to compartmentalize, to see through military maps rather than through moral vision, and this compartmentalization was essential to what was about to happen. The bombing was scheduled for exactly 9:30 in the morning. The weather had cleared enough for visual bombing. Everything was ready. The monks who remained in the monastery that morning felt the vibration first, a tremor in the ancient stones beneath their feet. The sky darkened not with clouds, but with the shape of bombers, wave after wave of them, their engines a thunder that grew louder and more terrible with each passing moment. Approximately 200 monks and civilian refugees had sheltered within the monastery walls, seeking protection in a place they believed would remain neutral in the violence that raged around it. Some were Benedictine brothers who had lived there for decades. Others were locals fleeing the fighting below. Families with children who had crowded into the catacombs and basement shelters of the building. There was no organized defense, no anti-aircraft guns mounted on the monastery itself. It stood exposed and vulnerable on its mountain peak. When the first bombs fell, they fell with a force that seemed to split the earth itself. The high explosive ordnance came first, shattering the carefully constructed walls, tearing through the ancient stone as if it were paper. The sound was beyond description, a roar that obliterated all other noise, all thought, all sense of safety or shelter. The monastery that had been a beacon of Western learning transformed in an instant into an inferno. The bombing continued for hours, wave after wave of American bombers making their run across the mountain, releasing their ordnance, and peeling away to make room for the next squadron behind them. Nearly 1,000 tons of bombs fell on that mountain in total, enough explosive force to level an entire city district, and all of it concentrated on a single building and the terrain immediately surrounding it. The monastic library, which contained manuscripts and documents spanning more than 1,000 years, was consumed in flames. The church itself, with its altar and its religious art, simply ceased to exist as a structure. The stone walls that had been built by Saint Benedict's disciples crumbled into rubble. The bell tower collapsed. The gardens that the monks had tended for centuries were scorched and torn. Dust rose in massive columns that could be seen from 30 kilometers away. The impact of so much ordnance, released with such precision and such overwhelming force, created shockwaves that knocked men down kilometers from the explosion. Those who survived inside the monastery described an apocalyptic landscape, a hell of fire and collapsing stone where moments before there had been sanctuary and silence. The bombing was not clean or surgical in its execution. War rarely is, despite the language commanders used to describe it. When the bombing finally ceased and the dust began to settle, what remained of the monastery was a scene of utter devastation. The entire upper structure had been reduced to rubble and fragments. Fires burned across the mountainside, fed by the phosphorus and napalm that continued to burn even after the high explosives had finished their work. The estimated 200 people killed in the bombing, monks, nuns, and civilian refugees, were entombed in the wreckage, their bodies mingled with 14 centuries of European history in the rubble. The scale of the destruction seems disproportionate to the military objective. A monastery was not a fortress. It held no ammunition depots, no headquarters, no organized military installation. The logic that had led to the bombing, the conviction that the monastery was being used as a German observation post, seemed to matter less now than the simple fact of what had been accomplished. A great work of human civilization had been obliterated. Whether that destruction had any meaningful military value would become a question that haunted the campaign for the rest of the war and beyond. The timing of the bombing, from a purely military perspective, could not have been worse. German commanders had not been occupying the monastery before the bombing. Intelligence later confirmed this uncomfortable truth. The monastery, despite all the suspicions and concerns of Allied officers, had remained primarily a religious sanctuary, a place of monks and refugees rather than a German strongpoint. But in the aftermath of the bombing, German military doctrine adapted to the new situation with brutal efficiency. Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, the elite aerial troops of the German army who often served as ground infantry, immediately moved into the ruins. The rubble provided even better defensive positions than the intact monastery would have offered. Walls of collapsed stone, interconnected tunnels formed by the destruction, multiple levels of fortification created by accident rather than design. All of this made the ruins of the monastery far more defensible than the original structure had ever been. The German commander, Field Marshal Kesselring, recognized the military gift that the bombing had inadvertently delivered. The Allies had destroyed a religious monument and killed civilian refugees, yet in doing so, they had actually strengthened the German defensive position. The monastery's destruction became a catastrophic strategic mistake, one that would cost thousands of additional lives in the weeks of fighting that followed. The propaganda impact of the bombing struck across the world with almost equal force to the physical destruction. Photographs of the ruins circulated through international newspapers and magazines. Religious leaders in neutral countries condemned the bombing as an attack on Christendom itself, on a symbol of European culture and faith. The Vatican, though technically neutral, expressed profound anguish over the destruction of a monastery that had stood in Christendom for more than 1,000 years. In Germany, Nazi propagandists seized on the bombing as proof of Allied barbarism, evidence that the Western powers cared nothing for the spiritual heritage of Europe. The narrative, regardless of whether the bombing had been militarily justified, had taken on a life of its own. The monastery's destruction became a symbol of the war's brutality, a tangible emblem of the price being paid for military victory. The young American pilots who had dropped the bombs were not monsters or murderers, they were soldiers following orders, and many of them carried no sense of guilt about hitting a military target. Yet the weight of what had happened, the sheer historical and cultural significance of what had been destroyed, pressed down on the campaign in ways that no amount of military justification could fully dispel. The monastery that Saint Benedict had built in the 6th century had been erased in a single morning. The rubble of the monastery became the focal point of the continued fighting that would dominate the next 3 months of the campaign. German paratroopers dug in among the stones, establishing interlocking fields of fire that would make any assault on the height nearly impossible to conduct without enormous casualties. The Allies had hoped that destroying the monastery would clear the way to breakthrough, that removing whatever military advantages the building might have provided would enable them to surge up the mountain and break through the Gustav Line. Instead, they found themselves facing an even more terrible defensive position. The rubble had created a natural fortress, a maze of stone and overlapping trenches that required attackers to advance in the open while defenders enjoyed protection in depth. The few trees that had grown on the mountainside were blasted away by the bombing, leaving the slopes bare and exposed. Any soldier attempting to climb that mountain would be visible to German defenders for nearly the entire ascent. The machine gun fire that greeted each assault came from fortified positions that were difficult to locate and nearly impossible to suppress with artillery fire alone. The bombing had been intended as a shortcut to victory, a way to break the stalemate through the application of air power. Instead, it had transformed the mountain into an even more terrible obstacle. The debate about the bombing had been fierce among the Allied commanders even before the decision was made, and it became even more intense in the aftermath of the destruction. General Bernard Montgomery, who had departed Italy weeks before, would almost surely have opposed the bombing on both tactical and moral grounds. General Alexander, the commander of all Allied forces in the Mediterranean, had carried the weight of the decision and had ultimately acquiesced to Clark's request, though without full enthusiasm. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, the naval commander, had been explicitly opposed to bombing a monastery, and had said so clearly in the meetings where the decision was being made. Yet the military logic of the age, the conviction that any obstacle to military victory should be removed if the technology existed to remove it, had carried the day. The bombing represented a kind of military thinking that was becoming more prevalent as the war intensified. The belief that civilian casualties and cultural destruction were acceptable prices for military advantage. This belief would manifest in even more terrible forms in the years to come, in the firebombing of German cities and the eventual use of atomic weapons against Japan. The monastery bombing was a precursor, a moment when the moral compromises of industrial warfare became concrete and visible and impossible to ignore. The human cost of the bombing extended far beyond those killed in the immediate destruction. The psychological impact on the soldiers who would have to assault the mountain in the weeks that followed, knowing now what the rubble concealed and what casualties awaited them, weighed heavily on morale. Officers struggled to explain to their men why a religious monument had been destroyed, why innocent civilians had been killed, and whether any military benefit had actually accrued from the bombing. The troops could see the answer themselves. The mountain was now more defensible, not less. The propaganda effect worked in multiple directions. Yes, it damaged the Allies' image around the world, but it also strengthened the resolve of German defenders, convincing them that they were fighting an enemy willing to destroy anything to achieve victory. The bombing of the monastery became a rallying cry for German troops, a reminder of why they had to hold the line. The Allies had sought to break through with explosives. Instead, they had hardened the resolve of their enemies and extended the campaign by weeks, perhaps months. The casualty figures that would accumulate over the subsequent assault would carry within them the cost of the bombing decision, deaths that might have been avoided if the Allies had simply accepted the military stalemate and tried a different approach. The physical traces of the destruction remained visible for years after the war. The monastery was not rebuilt until the 1950s, and when it was reconstructed, it was done in a way that attempted to honor the original structure while acknowledging the violent rupture in its history. The new monastery incorporated materials from the ruins, stones that had survived the bombing and had been carefully salvaged from the rubble. The symbolic meaning of the reconstruction was layered and complex. It spoke to the resilience of faith, to the determination to rebuild what had been destroyed, to the capacity of European civilization to recover from even the most terrible wounds. Yet it also stood as a memorial to what had been lost, a reminder that some things, once destroyed, can never be fully restored. The bombing of the monastery had been intended as a final solution to the military problem of Monte Cassino. Instead, it had created a problem that would haunt the Allies for the remainder of the war: the question of whether the bombing had been necessary, whether it had accomplished anything of military value, and what moral cost the war itself would bear for decisions of this kind. On the 15th of February 1944, nearly 1,000 tons of ordnance had fallen from American bombers onto a medieval monastery. The monks had rung their bells for the last time, and the war, in all its terrible complexity and moral ambiguity, had permanently altered the world of Western Christendom. Chapter 9. After the Rubble. In the aftermath of the bombing, silence descended across Monte Cassino like a shroud. The dust clouds that had risen thousands of meters into the winter sky gradually settled back to earth, revealing the true extent of what the bombers had accomplished. Where the monastery had stood for 1,400 years, a blackened wound scarred the mountainside. Walls that had withstood centuries of earthquakes, invasions, and the slow erosion of time had collapsed in minutes beneath the weight of nearly 1,000 tons of explosives. The Abbey of St. Benedict, sanctuary of faith and learning, was no more. What remained were jagged ruins, smoking rubble, and the terrible silence that follows destruction on such a scale. The monks who had survived the bombing, those who had not perished in the initial assault or the firestorms that followed, emerged from whatever shelter they had found to survey a world of apocalyptic devastation. The monastery's library, containing manuscripts dating back to the monastery's founding, had been consumed by flames. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, theological scholarship, and historical records had turned to ash. The spiritual heart of Western monasticism had been erased from the physical world in a single morning. And yet, even as the survivors picked through the wreckage, searching for bodies and salvaging what fragments of their former lives remained, other soldiers were already moving into position. The destruction that the Allies had intended to prevent German occupation had instead created something far more useful to the defenders: Within hours of the bombing's cessation, German paratroopers from the 14th Parachute Regiment, under the command of Major Helmuth Reusch, began moving into the ruins. These were elite troops, hardened by campaigns across North Africa and the Soviet Union, and they understood defensive warfare with an almost mathematical precision. What they discovered as they surveyed the bombed monastery was tactically superior to anything that had existed before. The rubble itself became fortification. Massive concrete blocks, twisted steel reinforcement from the monastery's walls, and the natural tumbled landscape created an intricate defensive maze. Artillery observers positioning themselves among the ruins could command perfect sight lines across the approach routes from below. Machine gun positions could be nested into pockets of stone that offered both protection and field of fire. The bombing, intended to deny the Germans their fortress, had instead handed them exactly what they wanted. The German paratroopers set about organizing their positions with methodical efficiency. They established interlocking fields of fire across the slopes, created ammunition and supply depots within the protected shell of the ruined monastery, and positioned observation posts that could direct artillery fire onto any Allied forces attempting the ascent. What had been a standing monastery, architecturally grand but strategically less ideal, was now a natural fortress of unprecedented strength. A defender in the monastery ruins could observe attackers approaching from nearly every direction, could call down artillery fire with devastating accuracy, and had infinite places to hide from counter-bombardment. The Allies, having hoped that destruction would serve them militarily, had instead inadvertently improved the German defensive position. This was the cruel irony that would only become clear in the weeks that followed. Back at Allied headquarters, the magnitude of what had occurred was beginning to filter through in reports and photographs. Intelligence officers studied aerial photographs taken in the hours after the bombing, and the pictures told a story that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The monastery was gone, but more troubling to those who understood German tactics was what happened next. German reinforcements began arriving at Monte Cassino. The paratroopers dug in with visible purposefulness. Anti-tank guns were positioned. Ammunition was stacked in carefully concealed locations. The Germans were not abandoning the mountain, they were fortifying it more heavily than ever. The calculation that had driven the bombing decision, that destruction would weaken German control, proved to be catastrophically wrong. The most damning realization came not in February, but in the weeks after, as interrogation of captured German prisoners and analysis of intelligence reports revealed a truth that cast the bombing in a harsh light. The monastery, before its destruction, had not been occupied by German combat troops. It had served as an observation post and had housed German officers who could direct artillery fire through its superior vantage point. But it had not been a defensive strongpoint in the way that American commanders had feared. The monks and civilian refugees sheltering within those walls had not been intermingled with Wehrmacht infantry. The building itself, though valuable to the Germans as a viewpoint, was not essential to their hold on the mountain. They could observe and control fire from 100 other positions in the surrounding peaks. The bombing had destroyed an ancient monument, killed civilians and monks, and in the process had served German defensive needs far better than any voluntary withdrawal could have. News of the bombing spread across the world with tremendous speed, and the consequences for the Allied cause were severe. The Vatican, already attempting to maintain neutrality in the conflict, issued statements expressing profound distress at the destruction of Christendom's most sacred monastery. If the intention had been to win hearts and minds among Catholic populations in Italy and throughout the world, the bombing achieved precisely the opposite effect. German propaganda seized upon the bombing with the kind of material that no propaganda ministry could have invented. Here was visible proof, they argued, of Allied disrespect for Christian civilization, of their willingness to destroy the monuments of Western culture in pursuit of military objectives. The irony that German forces were themselves destroying Italian towns and infrastructure with equal ruthlessness was lost in the immediate firestorm of international reaction. The bombing of the monastery became a symbol, rightly or wrongly, of Allied moral compromise. The strategic cost was equally significant. The bombing had not broken German resolve on the mountain. If anything, it had hardened it. The destruction meant that every soldier in the German paratroop regiment was acutely aware that he was fighting in a position of historic significance. The monastery's bombing had become a rallying point, a symbol that the Allies would stop at nothing to break through. The Germans could point to the ruins and tell their men that they were defending not just a military position, but the very foundations of European civilization. Whether this was cynical manipulation or genuine conviction hardly mattered in terms of military effect. The bombing had transformed Monte Cassino from a difficult position into a position invested with symbolic weight. Men fight harder for symbols than they do for mere geography. As the weeks following the bombing progressed, it became increasingly clear to Allied commanders that they had set in motion a chain of events that could not be easily reversed. The monastery was destroyed, but the destruction had achieved none of its intended military purpose. The Germans were stronger, not weaker. The rubble had become more formidable than the standing structure ever could have been, and the cost of the bombing, 200 civilians and monks dead, the destruction of one of Europe's greatest cultural monuments, the alienation of Catholic public opinion, was etched permanently into the record. Some commanders would later maintain that the bombing had been necessary, that the intelligence available at the time had seemed to justify it, that the pursuit of military advantage had been paramount. Others would carry the burden of the decision for the rest of their lives. What the bombing did achieve was clarity, of a sort. The illusion that destroying the monastery would unlock the gates of the Gustav Line had evaporated like the dust clouds that had risen above the mountain in that terrible February morning. The Allies would have to break through the German defences through raw military superiority, through the grinding expenditure of lives and resources, through patience and persistence. No single bombing campaign would do it. No tactical shortcut existed. The road forward lay only through weeks more of fighting on one of the most difficult mountains in Europe, against troops who were now more determined than ever to hold their ground. The battle for Cassino would continue, but with the monastery rubble standing as a monument to the complexity of warfare and the unintended consequences of military decisions made under extreme pressure and incomplete information. The German paratroopers, digging into their positions among the shattered stones of the monastery, understood what the Allies were only beginning to realize. They had been given a gift wrapped in destruction. They would make the Allies pay an enormous price for every meter of ground gained in the months ahead. The broken walls of the monastery would shelter German defenders and kill Allied soldiers in terrible numbers. The bombing, intended to clear an obstacle, had instead created a fortress of unparalleled strength. As February turned toward March and the weather began its gradual warming, both armies prepared for the next phase of the struggle. The monastery would burn in memory long after its physical form had been reduced to ash. In the ruins, German paratroopers waited and watched, secure in the knowledge that the mountain was now more defensible than it had ever been. The Allies would soon discover what this meant in terms of blood and suffering. The rubble of Monte Cassino Monastery still smoldered when American commanders issued the orders for the assault. The bombing had ceased on the 15th of February, and within hours the smoke began to clear from the slopes, revealing not opportunity, but a trap. What the strategists had hoped would be a weakened position for the taking had transformed, through the cruelty of unintended consequence, into something far more dangerous than before. The German paratroopers who arrived within days of the bombing did not find a defenseless heap. They found a fortress of broken stone and shattered walls that offered superior cover to the standing structure that had preceded it. Nature and destruction, when combined with German engineering and determination, had created something that would prove nearly impossible to assault from below. The very act intended to clear the way had, in fact, barricaded it more firmly. The American assault began in the final week of February, under conditions that seemed designed by fate to ensure suffering. The winter rains had continued their relentless assault on the peninsula, turning the slopes of Monte Cassino into a treacherous world of mud and water-carved ravines. The soldiers climbing those slopes came primarily from the 34th Infantry Division, men who had already spent weeks in the grinding attrition of the initial January assault. They were tired and diminished in number, yet command demanded they try again. The logic was simple: they must break through, must push forward, must not allow the Germans the luxury of a secured defensive line indefinitely. But logic, crafted in a warm tent, was a distant thing from the reality of climbing stone and mud under fire. The bombardment that preceded the assault lasted for 5 days straight, artillery from positions miles away pounding the monastery and its surroundings with an intensity meant to break both the landscape and the will of those defending it. When the infantry moved forward in the final days of February, they found that the artillery had accomplished something unexpected. The bombardment had in fact leveled much of the town of Cassino below the monastery, transforming streets into rubble and buildings into broken silhouettes against the winter sky. The destruction was thorough and absolute, yet destruction from the air, no matter how comprehensive, does not discriminate between soldier and civilian, between ammunition depot and monastery. The German defenders, by contrast, remained largely sheltered in their fortified positions, dug and reinforced over months of preparation. They had anticipated the bombardment and had withdrawn to their deepest bunkers and strongpoints, emerging when the shells ceased to rain down. The paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Corps were among the best soldiers Germany produced, hardened, disciplined, and utterly committed to holding their ground. When the American infantry began its advance up the slopes, they met a wall of machine gun fire from positions that had been carefully calculated and prepared for exactly this circumstance. The assault unfolded in waves across the mountainside, and each wave encountered resistance that seemed to intensify rather than weaken. The German defenders had the advantage that all attackers on broken terrain lack. They held the high ground and could see every approach route. American soldiers moving up the slopes were silhouetted against the lighter sky behind them, providing perfect targets for machine gunners who had nothing to do but wait and fire. The artillery fire that the Americans called down to suppress the German positions proved largely ineffective against opponents dug into rubble and stone fortifications. A soldier in a prepared defensive position, one that has been studied and reinforced and tested, can survive bombardment that would obliterate an exposed infantry company. The Americans, climbing without adequate cover and lacking the protection of substantial fortifications, could not. Casualties mounted with relentless precision as the assault continued through the grey days of late February. The town of Cassino itself became a secondary objective as American forces attempted to secure the base of the mountain before pushing higher. The destruction already inflicted by air and artillery had rendered much of the town unusable as either defensive position or shelter. What remained standing became a contested space where small unit actions determined the shape of the broader battle. American riflemen and machine gunners moved through rubble-choked streets, clearing buildings block by block in the grinding, exhausting work of urban combat. German defenders, though fewer in number in the town itself than on the mountain slopes, fought with the particular intensity that comes from fighting for survival in close quarters. By the standards of World War II combat, the fighting in Cassino Town was not the worst urban warfare the soldiers involved had encountered. That distinction would belong to other theatres and other cities, but it was brutal and unforgiving nonetheless. Each building cleared meant several casualties. Each position taken meant leaving men behind who would not rise when the advance moved forward. As February progressed toward its final days, the reality of the situation became increasingly clear to American commanders. The assault, despite all preparation and sacrifice, was not achieving the breakthrough that had been promised. The Germans held their positions, reinforced their damaged defenses, and inflicted casualties at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. The human cost of the assault mounted to levels that troubled even the commanders who had ordered it. Men hardened by years of war and responsible for making decisions that sent thousands of soldiers to probable death. Reports from forward positions spoke of exhaustion among the troops, of men who had been in combat for weeks without meaningful rest, of units that had been reduced to half strength or less by casualties and attrition. The supplies moving forward through the mud and rain struggled to keep pace with consumption. Ammunition ran low, medical supplies were stretched thin, and the ability to sustain the assault was reaching its limit. Against this grim reality stood German resistance that seemed not to diminish but rather to entrench itself more deeply with each passing day. The artillery barrages that accompanied the assault had inflicted a different kind of cost that military reports often failed to adequately capture. The town of Cassino, already damaged by the bombing campaign against the monastery, was subjected to additional bombardment from American artillery positions as American commanders sought to neutralize German defensive positions. The effect on the surviving civilian population was catastrophic. Refugees who had fled their homes in the weeks before the bombing, seeking shelter in surrounding villages and countryside, had begun to return as they heard rumors that the Americans were advancing. Some returned to the rubble of their homes seeking salvageable possessions. Others had nowhere else to go. The war had displaced them from everywhere else, and Cassino, despite its destruction, was home. The artillery fire that was meant to destroy German positions did not discriminate against civilians. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant, so clear in official military terminology, meant nothing to an artillery shell. Families sheltering in cellars and caves found those refuges collapsed by the bombardment. The human world of suffering, already vast by late February 1944, expanded further as the battle ground on. The specific tactical actions that comprised the assault became blurred in the broader pattern of failure and suffering. Infantry companies attempted to advance across open ground and were stopped by machine gun fire. Tank units tried to support the infantry and became bogged down in mud or were ambushed by German anti-tank guns positioned to cover approach routes. Engineers attempted to construct bridges over the rivers and streams swollen by winter rains and were driven back by fire from German positions across the water. Each specialized unit played its role in the assault and was repulsed or stalled in its attempt. The coordination that command had hoped would create an overwhelming pressure on the German line did not materialize in the way intended. Instead, American units found themselves attacking separately and sequentially, allowing German defenders to concentrate their fire on each element in turn. The advantage that numbers and material should have provided to the Allies, and did provide in many other battles, seemed negated by the terrible mathematics of defensive warfare on broken terrain. By the end of February, American commanders made the decision to consolidate their positions rather than continue the assault in its current form. The breakthrough had not come. The German line remained unbroken. The casualties had been severe, measured in thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing. But the strategic position had hardly changed from what it had been before the monastery bombing. American soldiers held somewhat more of the town of Cassino and some additional terrain on the slopes, but nothing that represented the kind of breakthrough that military strategy demanded. German forces remained in control of the key terrain that controlled access through the Liri Valley toward Rome. The Gustav Line was not broken. The fortress that Kesselring had constructed remained a barrier to further progress. The assault of February 1944 was, by any objective measure, a failure. The failure carried particular weight because it came after the bombing of the monastery, that most controversial decision made weeks earlier by General Clark and his staff. Questions that had simmered in the background of planning now became impossible to ignore. Had the bombing accomplished its military purpose, or had it merely destroyed a historic structure and accomplished nothing beyond that? The intelligence that had suggested the monastery was being used as a German observation post and artillery coordinator now came into question. No German soldiers had been found in the monastery itself when it was captured. No observation equipment or fire control centers had been discovered in its ruins. The bombing had been justified on military necessity, but the necessity now seemed questionable. Soldiers in the forward positions complained bitterly about orders that had sent them against fortified positions no weaker and possibly stronger than those they had faced before the bombing. The morale impact of the failed assault was compounded by the knowledge that the monastery had been destroyed, perhaps unnecessarily, in the attempt to break this line. The German commanders surveying the aftermath of the February assault found cause for satisfaction tempered by awareness of the larger strategic situation. Their defensive line had held despite the bombardment and the assault. Their paratroopers had proven their worth and their discipline in repelling American attacks. Yet they knew, as all military professionals did by the late winter of 1944, that the overall trajectory of the war favored the Allies. Germany could not replace the losses it was suffering. Germany could not produce aircraft in sufficient numbers to contest Allied air superiority. Germany could not manufacture tanks faster than the Allies could destroy them. Time was an ally to the Americans and the British, a cruel enemy to the Germans. What had been accomplished at Cassino in February was a victory in the tactical sense. The defense had held, but it was a victory that purchased only time, and time, for Germany, was not an infinite resource. The failure of the February assault meant that the campaign for Monte Cassino would extend into the spring. Additional Allied units would need to arrive and be positioned. Commanders would need to develop new strategies for breaking the stalemate. The Polish Second Corps, then still fighting in other theatres, would be brought into the battle with the hope that fresh troops and new approaches might succeed where the Americans had failed. The immediate consequence of the February failure was simply that the war would continue on this front, grinding forward with the inexorable slowness of attrition. Young men from America, Britain, Germany, and Poland would spend weeks climbing mountains and fighting in ruins before this question was resolved. The monastery, already reduced to rubble, would remain a symbol of the terrible cost of the war and the stubborn refusal of combatants to yield ground even when ground itself seemed to hold no strategic value beyond the principle of holding it. By the first weeks of March in 1944, the mountains around Cassino echoed with a sound that had not been heard there before, the voices of Polish soldiers. They came from the south, moving through the valleys in columns that stretched for kilometers, their uniforms distinct from the Americans and British, who had fought and bled on those slopes for 2 months already. General Władysław Anders led them, a man whose face bore the lines of a soldier who had endured imprisonment, escape, and endless struggle in service of a nation that no longer existed on any map under his country's own rule. The Polish II Corps numbered around 50,000 men, and they carried with them a burden that transcended the ordinary weight of military duty. Their homeland, Poland, lay beneath Nazi occupation, thousands of kilometers to the north, held beneath an iron boot by the very enemy they now marched to fight. When these soldiers looked at the mountain, they did not see merely another objective, another piece of terrain to be captured and held. They saw something far deeper, a test, a pathway, a symbolic first step toward the liberation of their own nation from tyranny. The journey that brought Anders and his Polish soldiers to Italy was itself a remarkable passage through the upheaval of war. After Poland's defeat in 1939, many Polish troops had been captured by German forces and spent years in prisoner-of-war camps, enduring hardship and degradation. Anders himself had been imprisoned in a Soviet camp. Poland had been invaded from 2 directions, east and west, and had been released to form a Polish army in exile, fighting alongside the Allies across North Africa and the Middle East. These men under his command were survivors of catastrophe. They had fought at Tobruk in Libya, at other engagements across the desert, and now they were being moved to the Italian theatre to reinforce the stalled offensive against the Gustav Line. They arrived exhausted but steeled with resolve, carrying not just rifles and ammunition, but the weight of national hope. Officers briefed them on the mountain objective, on the monastery that sat atop the 1,700-meter peak, on the German paratroopers dug into the rubble after the February bombing, on the countless attempts that had failed. The Polish soldiers listened with grim awareness of what lay ahead. The decision to place the Polish Second Corps at Cassino was not accidental. Allied commanders understood that fresh troops with specific motivation might accomplish what weeks of American assaults had failed to achieve. The Americans had attacked the monastery position from the south and west, trying to force their way up the slopes through German fire and impossible terrain. The Polish Corps would approach from the north and northeast, attacking the monastery from a different angle that might stretch German defensive resources further. Moreover, commanders believed, correctly, that Polish soldiers possessed a particular ferocity and commitment that derived from their specific circumstances. They were not fighting merely for abstract concepts of victory or Allied strategy. They were fighting toward the liberation of their own nation, and every advance northward through Italy represented a step closer to the possibility of returning home. This psychological element, though difficult to quantify in military reports, was real and powerful. The Polish soldiers' motivation was not manufactured by propaganda. It emerged from their lived experience of displacement, occupation, and a desperate hope that the defeat of Nazi Germany might mean the restoration of their independence. General Anders was a figure of considerable stature among the Polish military leadership, respected both for his military judgment and for his commitment to Polish independence. He had negotiated with British commanders to secure the best possible position and support for his corps, understanding that the mountain assault would be extraordinarily costly and that his soldiers deserved every advantage Allied resources could provide. He worked to ensure adequate artillery support, to secure positioning that offered tactical advantage, and to establish clear lines of communication and supply. Yet even with these preparations, the campaign ahead would demand enormous sacrifice from his soldiers. Anders knew this, his officers knew this, and the Polish soldiers themselves, having seen the battles of the previous months, having observed the casualties and the failed assaults, understood with clarity what awaited them on those slopes. Still they prepared, checking weapons, reviewing maps, writing letters home to a nation they could not yet reach. There was a quiet dignity in their preparations, a sense that they were participating in something larger than themselves, that their struggle against this mountain was connected to struggles across an entire continent. The terrain around Cassino had been transformed by months of warfare and the February bombing. The monastery itself stood as a ruined shell, its walls partially collapsed, its interior a labyrinth of broken stone and debris. German paratroopers had in fact moved into these ruins after the bombing, recognizing that the rubble provided exceptional defensive positions. The jagged walls offered cover and firing positions. The destroyed interior spaces created a fortress of irregular angles and blind corners that favored defenders. The approaches to the monastery remained heavily fortified with barbed wire, machine gun positions, and artillery observation posts. German engineers had spent weeks preparing what amounted to a fortress within a fortress, taking advantage of the physical chaos that the bombing had created. Around the monastery, extending down the slopes, the German defensive system remained formidable. Machine gun nests commanded the approaches. Artillery positions on reverse slopes could rain fire on any troops attempting to advance up the mountain. German reserves were positioned to move toward threatened sectors quickly. The mountain itself, with its steep slopes and exposed ridgelines, remained an adversary as brutal as any German soldier. Fog frequently rolled in, reducing visibility to mere meters and making coordinated assault nearly impossible. Rain turned the slopes into mud that clung to boots and slowed movement to a crawl. Against this world of fortification and natural obstacle, the Polish Second Corps positioned itself in late March, taking up lines to the north and northwest of the monastery. As they arrived and began constructing their positions, digging trenches and establishing supply dumps, they encountered the ruins of previous battles. American and British graves dotted the valleys and slopes. Destroyed vehicles and equipment lay scattered in valleys where they had been abandoned or destroyed. The physical evidence of months of grinding warfare surrounded them. Some soldiers maintained letters they had written or had received from family in Poland, letters that had traveled extraordinary distances through military postal systems, carrying messages from lands under occupation to men fighting in foreign mountains. The letters were treasured, read repeatedly, and carefully preserved. They connected the Polish soldiers to a reality that seemed increasingly distant, even as it motivated everything they did. Officers briefed their men on timing and objectives. The assault would not come immediately. First, the Allies needed to build supplies, to strengthen positions, to coordinate with American forces attacking from the south and west. Winter was finally releasing its grip on the mountains, and spring would bring better weather and more favorable conditions for sustaining supply lines. The first weeks of April saw the Polish Corps integrated into the larger Allied operational planning for what would be called the Fourth Major Assault on Cassino. In discussions between commanders, the Polish position to the north was recognized as offering genuine tactical advantage. If the Poles could break through the German lines in the northern sector and threaten the monastery from above, German defenders might be forced to shift reserves away from other parts of the line, weakening their overall position. American attacks from the south and west would then have better prospects of success. British forces would maintain pressure from other sectors. The entire German position on the Gustav Line, stretched thin and under siege from multiple directions, might finally break under coordinated assault. These strategic calculations, while sound in theory, would require the Polish soldiers to advance across terrain as murderous as any in the entire Italian campaign. They understood this. They accepted it. There was grim resignation in their preparations, but also a sense of purpose that transcended ordinary military duty. As March gave way to April, the Polish corps also received reinforcements and additional support, medium tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition in quantities larger than they had previously been allocated. Supply lines were improved to handle the increased throughput needed for a major offensive. Engineers surveyed the ground, identifying the paths of least resistance, noting where German positions seemed strongest and where they might be vulnerable to flanking action. Polish officers studied detailed maps and aerial photographs. They observed the monastery through binoculars and field glasses, watching for patterns in German movement, noting the locations of visible gun emplacements. They looked at their soldiers, young men mostly, some in their early 20s, some older, some veterans of previous campaigns, and some experiencing combat for the first time. All of them understood what was coming. All of them carried within themselves the weight of their nation's struggle. Polish chaplains moved among the soldiers in the days before the assault, providing religious services and spiritual comfort. Catholicism was deeply woven into Polish identity, and the assault on the monastery, even as a military objective, held symbolic and religious weight. Some Polish soldiers felt conflicted about attacking a Catholic monastery, even one occupied by German troops. The spiritual leadership of the corps addressed this directly, framing the assault as an act of liberation, as serving a larger cause that transcended the immediate military objective. Religion and national purpose intertwined. The soldiers attended services with intensity and focus, seeking comfort and moral clarity before what lay ahead. The preparations complete, the Polish II Corps waited through the final days of April for the signal to advance. They occupied trenches and defensive positions in the hills and valleys north of the monastery. American and British units held other sectors of the assault perimeter. German defenders, aware that a new offensive was coming, reinforced their positions and prepared for the onslaught. The entire theater of operations seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of a major clash that everyone recognized would be significant and costly. Supply trucks rumbled along mountain roads, delivering ammunition and rations. Artillerymen checked their guns and prepared firing tables. Infantry soldiers cleaned their weapons one final time and prepared themselves mentally for the assault ahead. Letters were written and entrusted to others for delivery home if the worst occurred. Photographs of family members and sweethearts were viewed and carefully stored. The Polish soldiers were ready as any human being can be for warfare they know will be brutal and costly. The first weeks of May would bring the climax of months of grinding warfare. The Polish Second Corps would prove themselves to be formidable soldiers, and their assault on the monastery would become legendary in Polish military history. But in these final days of April, as they prepared their positions and maintained their readiness, the future remained uncertain. What was certain was their commitment, their willingness to sacrifice, and their understanding that breaking through this mountain was a necessary step toward a larger liberation. They carried their nation's hope with them into those trenches and gun positions, hoping that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and that the world they fought for would, at some future point, allow them to return home. The winter of 1944 had tested every dimension of human endurance. February's bombing of the monastery and the grinding assaults that followed had left the landscape around Cassino scarred with shell craters, shattered stone, and the graves of thousands. Yet as March arrived, something shifted in the rhythm of the campaign. The rain that had turned the approaches to Monte Cassino into quagmires began to ease. The morning sun lingered a fraction longer each day. Supply convoys moved with increasing frequency along the roads from Naples northward, and across the Mediterranean, a new force was assembling, General Władysław Anders and his Polish II Corps, soldiers who would bring to this mountain fight a hunger for victory that transcended mere military calculation. The momentum that had stalled in the frozen mud of winter was beginning to build again, though none who had witnessed the February failure could know whether this renewed effort would finally shatter the Gustav Line or simply add another chapter of futility to the Cassino story. The Polish soldiers who began arriving in March carried histories that no American or British infantryman could fully comprehend. These were men whose homeland had been erased from the map by Nazi occupation, whose families faced the full machinery of German subjugation, whose very nation had become a testing ground for Nazi racial ideology. General Anders himself had escaped from a Soviet prisoner of war camp and fought his way to the Middle East, with the belief that his corps might yet strike a blow toward liberating Poland. When orders came to deploy to Italy and to take position on the left flank of the Allied assault, these men understood what was at stake in a way that transcended tactical geometry. For them, breaking through at Cassino meant proving that Polish arms could still strike against tyranny, that Polish soldiers remained in the fight for their continent's future. They took their positions with a grim awareness that this might be their only chance to contribute directly to the liberation of Europe. The weight of that knowledge settled upon them like a heavy pack as they marched toward the heights. The logistics that had crippled the earlier assaults were now being methodically addressed. Dumps of ammunition had been established at more accessible points. Supply roads had been improved and widened to handle the volume of material required for a sustained offensive. Field hospitals were positioned closer to the forward areas, staffed and ready. The quartermasters had learned harsh lessons from February's failures. Shortages of ammunition had halted attacks at critical moments, and wounded men had suffered in poorly supplied aid stations far from proper medical care. Now, months of experience in the Mediterranean and lessons absorbed from previous campaigns elsewhere meant that the machinery of supply was working with greater efficiency. Trucks moved steadily from the depots toward the gun positions. Engineers had constructed better roads up the lower slopes of Monte Cassino and through the valleys that would serve as assembly areas. The grinding frustration of January and February, when men had fought with inadequate support, was being replaced by the kind of logistics infrastructure that the Allies had learned to build across North Africa and in other theatres. The tactical picture was also becoming clearer, refined by weeks of observation and the bitter experience of failed assaults. The Germans had revealed their defensive strategy through their reactions to previous attacks. Monte Cassino itself would require the Polish corps to assault from the north and northwest, working their way up terrain that was steep and exposed. To the south and west, other units would press against the positions that defended the approach to the monastery and the town of Cassino below it. The concept that was being developed involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, a strategy designed to prevent the Germans from concentrating their forces against any single assault. Where earlier attacks had been launched somewhat piecemeal, with units attacking in sequence or isolation, this new assault would demand precision coordination across a wide front. The challenge of executing such coordination across broken terrain with limited communications would be immense. Yet the lessons learned from February's stumbling, uncoordinated efforts made the necessity clear. The Germans controlled the high ground and could observe nearly every movement in the approaches. Surprise would be nearly impossible, but coordinated volume might overwhelm them. Weather patterns in March provided another crucial advantage that had been desperately lacking in the previous winter months. The heavy rains that had turned every stream into a torrent and every slope into a treacherous quagmire began to diminish. The frozen peaks that had made climbing nearly impossible in conditions of ice and wind softened as daytime temperatures rose above freezing. For infantrymen carrying heavy loads uphill into prepared defensive positions, weather was not a minor consideration. It was the difference between movement and paralysis, between maintaining strength and surrendering to exposure. The men beginning to move toward their assembly positions for the new assault could move faster, climb easier, and maintain their grip on weapons and equipment without the constant fear of deadly falls on iced terrain. The supply trucks could negotiate the mountain roads with less danger of sliding off precipices. The ammunition dumps were less likely to become temporarily inaccessible due to weather. Every marginal improvement in conditions multiplied through the entire apparatus of warfare, creating compound advantages that made the difference between tactical possibility and tactical impossibility. Air superiority, which had grown steadily as Allied strength increased, was now becoming an overwhelming advantage that the Germans could no longer contest. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies over Italy through attrition and the mounting casualties it suffered in every engagement. German pilots, once they achieved victory, were captured or killed and lost forever. There were no pilot replacement depots turning out new trained pilots to replace the fallen. In contrast, American and British air forces could replace damaged aircraft within days and rotate experienced pilots home to train new ones. The result was that German forces at Cassino could expect no air support whatsoever, while Allied aircraft could operate almost freely. This meant reconnaissance aircraft could observe German movements without opposition. It meant that German supply columns moving at night could still be attacked if spotted. It meant that when major assaults were launched, Allied bombers and fighters would be available to break up German counterattacks or suppress defensive positions. For the infantry below, knowing that the sky belonged to their side meant an enormous boost to morale and confidence that had been absent in earlier months. The human element of the assault force also showed signs of change compared to the exhausted, worn units that had fought through January and February. Replacement troops had arrived to flesh out units that had been reduced by casualties. New units had been formed or rotated in from other theatres. The psychological impact of finally having adequate manpower and equipment was substantial. Men who had been asked to do more with less began to see the possibility of success. Training for the assault had improved. Veterans who had survived earlier attempts at breaking through could share their hard-won knowledge with newer soldiers who might otherwise have repeated their mistakes. The officers and sergeants who led these men had learned what worked and what failed in this peculiar terrain and against these particular enemies. The grinding attrition of the previous campaign had not broken the will of the Allied armies. Rather, it had refined them, focused them, and convinced them that if they could survive this far, breaking through was possible. The mood in the camps and assembly areas was one of grim determination rather than the desperation or the casual confidence that had preceded earlier attacks. The German defenders, by contrast, were showing signs of strain that no amount of determination could entirely overcome. Casualties among the elite units holding the Gustav Line had been severe. The paratroops defending Monte Cassino and its approaches had fought continuously since the line was established, with only brief rotations to rear areas. Reinforcements from Germany were becoming harder to obtain as the strategic situation worsened elsewhere. The Soviets were pressing westward from the east, demanding German attention and resources. Plans for operations against the Italian allies and partisans continued to consume manpower. The result was that German divisions in Italy were not being maintained at full strength. each casualty represented a permanent loss in a way that was less true for the Allies. The German commanders at Cassino and along the Gustav Line were being asked to hold impossible terrain against growing numbers with decreasing strength. The mathematics of attrition were beginning to work against them, though this was a truth that would not become entirely apparent until the assault finally succeeded. The psychological preparation for the assault represented a crucial element that had been painfully absent in the chaotic preparations for February's disaster. This time, commanders took pains to brief their troops thoroughly about what they would face, what was expected of them, and how their individual efforts connected to the larger strategy. The men would not be sent forward in confusion about their objectives or the tactics being employed. Where possible, they were shown maps, briefed by officers who had studied the terrain and given time to absorb what they would face. For the Polish Corps in particular, the briefings took on an almost ceremonial quality. These men were not simply being sent to capture a mountain peak. They were being asked to strike a symbolic blow against the occupier of their homeland. The spiritual dimension of their participation was acknowledged and encouraged. The opportunity to prove that Polish soldiers remained formidable and could contribute to the liberation of Europe was laid out with clarity and purpose. The result was an almost palpable shift in the atmosphere as March progressed. This time, the assault would be different. The coordination between Allied forces was also improving in ways that reflected months of learning how to conduct combined operations in difficult terrain. The Eighth Army under General Oliver Leese was coordinating its assault from the north and east, moving toward the Liri Valley. The Fifth Army under General Mark Clark was preparing its assault from the west and southwest, with the Polish Corps positioned to attack the monastery itself from the northwest. The Americans and British had learned to synchronize their movements through better communication systems and more detailed planning conferences. Corps commanders met with divisional commanders, who met with regimental commanders, who briefed their troops. The flow of information, the clarity of purpose, and the precision of coordination stood in sharp contrast to earlier operations. This was not yet the polished machine that would conduct the Normandy invasion or later campaigns, but it represented a substantial improvement. The lessons of previous failures were being institutionalized in doctrine and practice. Supply lines stretching back toward Naples and the ports beyond represented the material foundation upon which all of this preparation rested. Ships had brought ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Railroads and truck convoys had moved these materials forward toward the front. Thousands of support troops worked in depots and supply points, ensuring that everything needed for the assault would be available at the moment it was required. The visibility of this supply apparatus, the convoys on the roads, the dumps at various locations, the sustained flow of material, provided a form of psychological reassurance that had been absent when supplies were scarce. Men advancing into battle feel more confident when they know that ammunition, medical supplies, and relief are available behind them. The logistical machine of the Allies, at its core, represented an advantage that German forces could simply not match. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts with increasingly limited productive capacity. The United States and Britain had industrial bases that were not threatened by enemy bombing or ground combat. The disparity in productive capacity was becoming ever more visible in the accumulation of material around Cassino. As March drew toward its conclusion, the entire assembly was complete. The Polish II Corps held its positions to the north and northwest. American and British units were positioned across the approaches to the Gustav Line. Artillery had been moved into position. Hundreds of guns were ready to provide support for the assault. Ammunition had been stockpiled in quantities that would have been unimaginable in January. Reconnaissance aircraft had mapped every known German position, every likely alternate position, every supply route and communication line. The weather had improved substantially. The tactical plan had been refined through careful study and coordination. The troops were as ready as they could possibly be made. Officers and men alike understood what was being asked of them and what was at stake. The failures of January and February had taught hard lessons, but they had not broken the will of the Allied command structure or the soldiers under their orders. As the calendar page turned toward April, the assault that would finally break the stalemate was being readied with a thoroughness and determination that came only from having learned through bitter experience that anything less would result in failure. By mid-March of 1944, the Allies stood at a crossroads. 2 assaults on Monte Cassino had failed. The monastery lay in ruins, and yet German paratroopers occupied those very ruins more effectively than before. The first weeks of spring brought not relief, but a grim reckoning. The campaign that commanders had promised would take weeks had stretched into months. The Gustav Line remained unbroken. Rome still lay beyond reach, and across the muddy valleys and fog-shrouded slopes of southern Italy, thousands of soldiers waited in the cold, preparing for what many suspected would be the bloodiest attempt yet to crack the German fortress. The scale of what the Allies were preparing was without precedent in the campaign so far. General Alexander, commanding the overall Mediterranean theatre, had made a decision. Cassino would not be bypassed, starved, or abandoned. It would be taken. To accomplish this, he committed forces on a magnitude the mountain had not yet witnessed. The Polish II Corps under General Anders moved into position north of the monastery. Canadian forces, having fought through the North African desert and Sicily, took stations to the west. American and New Zealand divisions prepared to renew their assault from multiple approaches. British forces consolidated their holdings and prepared to push through the Liri Valley the moment the German position fractured. For the first time since the campaign began, the mountain faced an enemy that would attack from all sides simultaneously and would not stop until one side or the other broke. The artillery preparation for this third offensive was industrial in scale. British and American guns, arranged in massive concentrations along the valleys and ridges, numbered in the thousands. Command posts covered maps with firing coordinates. Ammunition trains rolled forward through the night, headlights dimmed, carrying shells from factories in North Africa, and supplies landed at ports weeks earlier. An American commander observed that the sound of guns being registered in firing test rounds to confirm their accuracy never stopped during those final days before the assault. The Germans, watching from their fortified positions, could see the build-up with absolute clarity. They knew an offensive was coming. They did not know precisely when, but they had weeks to prepare their defenses, to dig deeper, to position reserves, to calculate where the Allies would strike hardest, and concentrate their defenders accordingly. What the Allies possessed that they had lacked in January and February was air superiority so complete that it bordered on the total. American and British fighters had methodically degraded German air strength across Italy throughout the winter. By March, Allied squadrons could operate with near impunity. German fighters appeared rarely. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over the Gustav Line and reported German positions with photographic precision. When the assault began, Allied air forces would not be defending themselves or escaping enemy fighters. They would be free to attack targets on the ground without threat. For an army fighting in mountainous terrain, where observation and communication became everything, air superiority meant seeing the enemy while remaining unseen, spotting German reinforcements while those reinforcements moved, hitting supply lines before supplies reached forward positions. The morning of the 15th of March arrived grey and cold. Fog clung to the mountainsides, reducing visibility to mere tens of meters in places. The guns began their bombardment at dawn, rolling barrages that started at the rear German positions and crept forward toward the mountain itself. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that soldiers described afterward as physical, as if the air itself had turned solid and was pressing down upon them. Buildings in the town of Cassino, already heavily damaged from previous fighting, collapsed further under the weight of falling shells. For 2 hours, the barrage continued without pause. German defenders huddled in their fortified positions, pressing themselves against concrete and stone, waiting for the ground to stop shaking. Dust and smoke rose until the fog mixed with cordite and pulverized masonry, creating a grey twilight at midday. Then the infantry went forward. American soldiers moved up the slopes from the southwest, advancing in the grinding manner that had become all too familiar. They moved from shell crater to shell crater, using the craters left by previous bombardments as cover. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions on the higher slopes. Mortars, their crews having learned to navigate by sound and memory during the bombardment, dropped rounds among the advancing Americans with terrible accuracy. Soldiers who had survived 2 previous assaults up this same mountain found themselves confronted with the same broken ground, the same fields of fire controlled by enemy weapons, the same impassable terrain. Progress came in meters. A squad would advance 50 meters and find itself pinned, unable to continue, unable to retreat, calling for supporting fire that took minutes to arrive. When it arrived, the enemy would shift their weapons slightly and resume fire at a different point. The Polish corps to the north faced equally terrible conditions. General Anders had positioned his men to assault the monastery ruins directly, which meant climbing steep slopes with minimal cover, advancing across open ground where German observers on higher elevations could direct artillery and machine gun fire with perfect observation. The Poles had fought in North Africa, and many had escaped imprisonment in the Soviet Union to join the British Army. They understood what they were fighting for, not merely military objectives on an Italian mountain, but the liberation of their homeland from German occupation. This knowledge gave them a quality that some soldiers possess and others do not: a willingness to continue when reason suggested stopping, to advance when survival suggested retreating, to hold ground when abandoning it would have been tactically sensible. But knowledge and willingness, while necessary, are not sufficient when the ground itself works against you and the enemy has had weeks to prepare. By evening of the first day, the gains were measured in hundreds of meters at terrible cost. American forces had advanced perhaps 1,000 meters in some sectors, far less in others. The Polish had reached the lower slopes leading to the monastery, but had not yet engaged the main German defensive positions at the summit. Casualties were already heavy. Hundreds of men killed, wounded, or missing in the first 12 hours. Supply lines, moving along roads churned by previous bombardments and constantly swept by German artillery, struggled to bring ammunition and medical supplies forward. Ambulances, their red crosses visible through the fog and smoke, wound down the mountain tracks, carrying wounded men whose screams and groans created a bass note beneath all other sounds of war. The German positions, despite the hours of bombardment, remained intact in their essential structure. They had been built to withstand exactly this kind of preparation. They had been built by German engineers who understood that any fortress must be deep, interconnected, and resilient against any single attack. As days turned into a second week of fighting, the pattern became terribly clear. The third assault on Cassino was not going to produce a breakthrough in days. Instead, It was producing another grinding, attritional campaign. Weather worsened, rain turned the slopes into mud. Fog descended so thickly that soldiers could not see the ground a few meters ahead. Machine gunners fired into the grey, hitting targets they could not see, guided by muzzle flashes and the sounds of advancing feet. Artillery continued without pause, the guns firing thousands of rounds daily, consuming supplies at a rate that placed enormous pressure on the logistical network stretching back to the ports. Soldiers who had pushed forward in the morning found themselves still in the same position in the evening, having gained ground but lost it again, held positions that were untenable, then been reinforced and held them again. The Germans, commanded now by paratroopers who had moved into the monastery ruins and taken over the defense of the sector, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and professionalism. These were not conscripts or replacements. They were veteran airborne soldiers who had trained to fight defensive battles in difficult terrain. They organized counterattacks at night, moving down the slopes to probe Allied positions, probing for weaknesses, making the Allies bleed even when the Allies were not actively attacking. They controlled the high ground, which meant that any Allied advance could be observed and engaged from multiple angles. They had prepared their positions with the meticulous care of German military tradition. Every machine gun positioned to cover every approach, fields of fire calculated down to the meter, ammunition distributed to allow sustained fire through a siege. By the end of the third week of fighting, the reality had become unmistakable. The third assault on Cassino was not succeeding in the way that Alexander and Clark and the other commanders had hoped. The mountain was not falling. The German defenses were not breaking. Casualties were mounting toward astronomical figures. American infantry units that had entered the line with full strength were reduced to skeleton companies. Polish battalions that had marched up from their staging areas singing were now shuffling forward in silence, their numbers depleted, their confidence shaken. New Zealand forces brought into the battle found themselves in the same situation as their predecessors, caught in a battle of attrition on terrain that favoured the defender, fighting an enemy that would not yield, making marginal progress at catastrophic cost. Yet this was not failure in the way that the first two assaults had been failures. The Allies were not being repulsed, they were not retreating, they were advancing, though slowly, though at terrible cost, though in ways that seemed nearly meaningless when measured against the numbers of men being killed and wounded. The artillery bombardment had disrupted German supply lines. Shells were becoming more difficult to obtain. Reinforcements were delayed. The constant pressure of attack meant that German defenders could not rest, could not be relieved, could not step back to recover. This was attrition in its rawest form, and the Allies had more resources than the Germans did. If the campaign continued at this pace and intensity, eventually the Germans would break, simply because they would not have enough men left to hold the line. By April, the third assault was still ongoing, though it had long since ceased to be a single coordinated offensive and had transformed instead into a continuous grinding campaign. Weather improved and worsened by turns. Supplies flowed forward and sometimes did not arrive. Men advanced and sometimes fell back. The mountains seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight, perpetually covered in fog and smoke, perpetually echoing with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. The question that commanders now asked themselves was not whether they would eventually break through. They would. The mathematics of attrition assured them of that. But whether the cost would be bearable, whether the number of men they would need to sacrifice would be acceptable when set against the objective of capturing a single mountain. This was the reality of the third assault on Cassino. Not quick victory or dramatic breakthrough, but the methodical, remorseless application of overwhelming force against a position that would not yield quickly. By May, the mountain had claimed so many lives that the ground itself seemed to recoil from violence. The winter had passed into spring, and still Monte Cassino stood. The monastery ruins remained unconquered, a broken crown atop the 1,700-meter peak, defended by German paratroopers who had transformed rubble into fortress. 3 times the Allies had launched major offensives. 3 times they had failed. The casualty lists grew longer with each attempt. Americans, British, New Zealanders, Canadians, Indians, French, South Africans. Soldiers from across the world had climbed those slopes, only to be turned back by men who refused to yield ground. The Gustav Line held. The stalemate persisted. And yet, in the camps and bivouacs behind the lines, a different force was gathering strength. The Polish Second Corps, hardened by campaigns across North Africa, was preparing for something their commanders sensed might be different this time. General Władysław Anders moved among his troops with quiet conviction. These were men who had endured occupation, exile, and endless fighting. For them, this mountain meant more than a tactical objective marked on a military map. The Polish corps had arrived in Italy months earlier, but their role had been to reinforce other sectors of the line. By early May, however, the strategic picture was shifting. The Allies had regrouped, brought in fresh divisions, accumulated supplies at a rate the Germans could not match, and coordinated their planning with new intensity. The decision had been made to concentrate overwhelming force on a narrow front and break through, not by frontal assault alone, but by coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The Polish II Corps would receive the assignment to assault Monte Cassino from the north, approaching the monastery directly. To their right and below them, American and British forces would attack from the west and southwest. Indian and Canadian units would strike from different angles. The Germans, stretched thin across the line and unable to concentrate reserves quickly enough, would face pressure they could not contain. This was the strategy born from 4 months of failure and terrible learning. Not elegance, but weight. Not finesse, but relentlessness. The supplies began to accumulate in May. Trucks groaning under loads of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacements. The artillery preparation that would precede the assault grew in scale and fury. The Allies possessed overwhelming air superiority now, and their gunners had learned to calculate fire with mathematical precision. The Polish soldiers, drawn from units that had fought the Germans in North Africa and who carried memories of their occupied homeland, understood the significance of what was coming. Many had lost family members in the Nazi occupation. Many harbored a burning desire to strike back not just for military victory, but for Poland itself. General Anders had carefully nurtured this sense of purpose among his men. The monastery on the mountain was not merely a German strongpoint to be captured and reported to higher command. It was a symbol. To take it would mean something beyond the strategic implications for the Gulf Line's collapse. It would mean that Polish soldiers had struck a blow against the enemy that had invaded and devastated their nation. The morale in the camps was high, in a way that had been absent during the earlier assaults. On the 17th of May, the bombardment began. The artillery preparation for the final assault on Monte Cassino was unprecedented in its scale. Guns positioned across the valley and on the surrounding heights opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of sound that could be heard kilometers away. The shells screamed across the sky and crashed into the rubble of the monastery and the slopes around it. The Germans, well entrenched and prepared, returned fire with their own artillery and mortars. The intensity built throughout the day and into the night, creating a continuous roar of explosives that shook the earth itself. Observers watching from the command posts could see the mountain shrouded in smoke and dust, illuminated by the flash of countless detonations. The bombardment was designed to break German morale as much as to destroy defensive positions. It was psychological warfare married to material annihilation. The message was simple. The Allies were coming, and this time they would come with resources the Germans could not match or resist. The Polish assault began as dawn broke on the 18th of May. The soldiers moved forward in coordinated waves, following the carefully planned attack scheme that had been briefed and rehearsed over days. The terrain was as brutal as it had been for every previous assault. Steep slopes, loose rock, limited cover, and defended by men who knew every fold and crevice of the mountain. But this time, the Polish soldiers advanced with the artillery fire still crashing around them, kept close to the explosions to suppress German defenders. The tactical coordination was tighter, the troops better equipped, the momentum behind their advance more formidable. The German paratroopers fought with their usual skill and determination, but they were outnumbered and could not bring reserves forward quickly enough to contain the breakthrough. The battle was vicious and close in many places. Hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, grenade exchanges across rubble, desperate stands in positions that could not be held against the onslaught of determined men. The Polish soldiers climbed higher through the day and into the next. They suffered casualties. Men fell to machine gun fire, artillery, and determined German counterattacks. But the Polish lines advanced. They had learned from the failures of the previous offensives, had studied the mountain's defenses, and had come prepared to accept losses that would achieve breakthrough rather than stalemate. There was a grim, almost inexorable quality to their advance. They came in formations, they suppressed German fire with their own weapons, they moved around strong points and flanked isolated defenders. Some German positions were overrun, others were pinned down and eventually abandoned. The German commander recognized that his line was collapsing and ordered a careful withdrawal to prepared positions further north, understanding that he could not hold Monte Cassino indefinitely against this coordinated assault. The decision was made to trade ground for time, to fall back and establish a new defensive line. By the 18th of May in the afternoon, Polish troops were moving through the ruins of the monastery itself. They climbed over broken stone and shattered walls, over centuries-old fragments now reduced to rubble by the bombing that had preceded the assault. There was something profoundly symbolic in the moment. Polish soldiers, whose nation had been devastated by Nazi occupation, now advancing through the ruins of what the Germans had destroyed in their effort to defend their positions. The soldiers of the Second Corps planted their flag on the highest point of the ruins, a white and red flag against the sky. The message flashed down the mountain and across the radios. Monte Cassino had fallen. The monastery ruins were in Polish hands. The breakthrough had finally come. The significance of the moment was understood immediately across the entire front. If the monastery could be taken, then the Gustav Line itself could be broken. German forces began a coordinated withdrawal northward, pulling back from positions they had held and defended fiercely for months. The Liri Valley, which lay directly beyond Monte Cassino, suddenly became accessible. The route toward Rome opened. The stalemate that had gripped the Italian campaign since the previous autumn was ending. The news spread through the Allied camps: relief, exhaustion, and a sense that something fundamental had shifted. The grinding war of attrition had finally yielded to momentum. The cost of the Polish breakthrough was severe. The Second Corps suffered more than 4,000 casualties in the assault on Monte Cassino, killed, wounded, or missing. The casualty rate approached or exceeded losses from previous assaults, but this time they had achieved what 3 previous offensives could not: the Allies had broken through. German defensive positions that had seemed unbreakable had yielded. The psychological impact extended far beyond the military implications. For Polish soldiers fighting under a government in exile, fighting for a homeland still under Nazi occupation, the capture of the monastery represented something that went beyond tactical victories or strategic positions. They had struck a blow against an enemy that could not be undone, had participated in a moment that would be remembered and celebrated, had contributed to the liberation of Europe, not as subordinates to British or American commands, but as soldiers of their own nation. The German withdrawal was not a rout or a panic. It was carefully conducted, with rear guards maintaining positions to slow the Allied advance, while main forces fell back to the next prepared defensive line. The paratroopers who had held Monte Cassino fought their last actions with the same discipline they had shown throughout the campaign. They inflicted continued casualties on advancing Allied forces, destroyed supplies and equipment as they withdrew, and made every kilometre cost blood and effort. But they could not hold the line. The numerical superiority of the Allies, the concentrated firepower they could bring to bear, and the momentum generated by the breakthrough proved overwhelming. For the first time since the winter, it became clear that German defensive lines could be broken, that the fortress positions could not hold indefinitely against sustained pressure. In the days following the breakthrough, the Allies poured forces through the gaps in the Gustav Line. American divisions advanced into the Liri Valley, British and Canadian units pushed forward. French colonial forces captured positions that had seemed impregnable. The German forces conducted an orderly fighting withdrawal, but their ability to hold a continuous defensive line had been shattered. Supply lines that had been clogged for months suddenly flowed forward again. Divisions that had been locked in static positions for weeks began to move. The entire complexion of the Italian campaign transformed from a grinding war of attrition into a war of movement. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army, which had suffered so much in previous offensives, suddenly found its path forward opening. The road to Rome, which had seemed so distant and unattainable, became visible and achievable. The Polish flag on the ruins of Monte Cassino became an iconic image of the campaign's turning point. It represented not just a military victory, but a moment when an ancient fortress that had seemed eternal finally fell to human will and determination. The monastery would eventually be rebuilt in the 1950s, restored to something approaching its former glory, a phoenix rising from ashes. But for the soldiers who had fought and fallen on those slopes, Polish, American, British, German, and soldiers from a dozen other nations, the mountain's significance lay not in its reconstruction, but in what it had taught about the nature of modern warfare. Fortress lines could be broken, seemingly impregnable positions could fall. What was required was coordination, concentration of force, acceptance of casualties, and the will to continue when earlier attempts had failed. The Allies had learned those lessons at terrible cost, and they would carry those lessons with them as they pursued the German armies northward through Italy and eventually toward Germany itself. The summit falls silent, not with peace, but with the exhaustion of those who have fought beyond the limits of human endurance. Polish boots stand on Polish soil no longer. They stand on rubble that was once stone, now turned to dust and ash. The flag planted at 1800 hours on the 18th of May signals something the Allies have waited 133 days to achieve. The Gustav Line, that monument to German engineering and defensive calculation, has been breached not at its weakest point, but at its symbolic heart. For the first time since the autumn, the possibility of movement emerges from the grinding stasis of winter warfare. German commanders now face a choice that has haunted them since the monastery's fall. hold impossibly difficult terrain with exhausted men, or execute the withdrawal they have quietly prepared for weeks. The calculation shifts from how to defend to how to retreat while maintaining coherence. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understands the mathematics as clearly as any Allied general. With 190,000 German troops stretched across a narrowing front, and with Monte Cassino now in enemy hands, the Gustav Line transforms from a fortress into a trap. The alternative, falling back to prepared positions further north, becomes not merely advisable, but necessary for the survival of his armies. The Liri Valley, that geographic funnel running northward from the broken Gustav Line toward Rome, opens like a door whose lock has finally been picked. For months, this valley floor has been visible to attacking forces but entirely inaccessible, dominated by German artillery positions and observation points located on the heights that the Allies could not take. The valley itself is a ribbon of agricultural land, relatively flat compared to the mountains that flank it, roads running northward in directions that lead toward the Italian capital and beyond. The Eighth Army under General Oliver Leese has positioned forces to exploit precisely this moment. Troops trained in mobile warfare, equipped with armor, prepared to drive northward through relatively open terrain. The breakthrough that senior commanders imagined in winter optimism and abandoned in winter realism suddenly becomes tactically feasible. German forces cannot defend the valley's entrance if they have lost the heights that command it. They cannot maintain their positions along the Rapido and Garigliano rivers, those water barriers that bought them months of relative security, once the Gustav Line's northern anchor collapses. The German withdrawal, therefore, becomes not a sudden rout, but a carefully managed disengagement conducted in phases. Kesselring orders his divisions to pull back in stages, establishing temporary defensive positions in rearward terrain, fighting delaying actions designed to slow the Allied advance without committing forces to static defense they cannot hold. The weather transforms almost simultaneously with the military situation. Spring has truly arrived in southern Italy by mid-May, and the torrential rains that turned the approaches to Cassino into quagmires have largely ceased. The ground hardens. Dust rises from roads that were impassable mud weeks earlier. Supply convoys that crawled forward at walking pace can now move at something approaching military speed. The Eighth Army's mechanized forces begin to concentrate in the Liri Valley, armor battalions and motorized infantry units preparing to advance northward. Allied air superiority, which has grown steadily as German fighter strength has dwindled through attrition and commitment elsewhere, now becomes a decisive factor in the pursuit. German vehicles moving along roads during daylight hours face constant threat from fighter bombers that dominate the Italian sky. The Luftwaffe, stretched across 3 theaters and hemorrhaging trained pilots faster than replacements can arrive from Germany, cannot contest air superiority effectively. Therefore, German movement becomes constrained to darkness and the brief hours of dawn and dusk. Convoys travel at night through roads illuminated inadequately by moonlight or the occasional flare. Marching columns rest hidden in forests and ravines during daylight. The withdrawal transforms into a tactical ballet performed under the constant threat of air attack. German engineers work frantically to prepare the next defensive line, the Hitler Line running roughly north to south across the narrowing Italian peninsula, approximately 40 kilometers north of the Gustav Line's main positions. The human cost of the pursuit falls disproportionately on German forces unable to escape quickly enough or defend territory that their commanders have already decided to abandon. Rear guard units, composed often of grenadier companies or panzer grenadier platoons, fight actions designed to delay rather than win, buying time for main force elements to withdraw. These men know the mathematics of their situation. They are fighting not to hold territory but to delay the inevitable, conducting a series of small battles they cannot win, but must fight to their last man to allow others to escape. Some German units manage coordinated withdrawal. Others fragment under pressure and pursue, their coherence dissolving into scattered groups moving northward by whatever routes remain open. Weeks of static warfare have been replaced by pursuit, and pursuit, the movement of forces through space toward a defined objective, represents the kind of warfare for which mechanized armies are designed. The Eighth Army's armor, confined to limited maneuvers around Monte Cassino's slopes, can now operate in the broader terrain of the Liri Valley. British and Canadian tank regiments advance northward, infantry riding on vehicles or traveling in trucks, the pace far exceeding the grinding 100 meters per day that characterized the fighting for the monastery. German rearguards attempt to slow this advance through roadblocks, anti-tank guns positioned in defensive lines, occasionally counterattacks designed to disrupt the Allied momentum. None of these measures succeeds in stopping the advance. They merely slow it marginally, exacting casualties that diminish German strength further. The town of Frosinone, roughly 60 kilometers north of the Cassino Monastery along the road toward Rome, becomes the target and the symbol of the first phase of this pursuit. German forces must either defend it or abandon it. Kesselring chooses abandonment. The town, located on the route toward the Italian capital, had been partially destroyed by earlier fighting and bombing. German forces passed through it and established temporary defensive positions on its northern approaches, sufficient to delay the Eighth Army for a few days, but insufficient to hold it against determined assault. British and Canadian forces, now moving at the pace of mechanized pursuit rather than the grinding attrition of siege warfare, reach Frosinone and secure it against crumbling German resistance. The town's capture becomes significant less for its military value than for what it represents. Momentum. The stalemate has broken. The Allies are moving toward Rome. Kesselring withdraws further north, accepting the loss of territory he has defended at enormous cost in human life. The strategic calculation has shifted. The German general understands that the Gustav Line cannot be held once its northern positions have been compromised by the fall of Monte Cassino. He is orchestrating an orderly retreat designed to preserve his armies for fighting further north, where terrain becomes difficult again, where defensive positions can be established, where German forces might continue to exact a price from the pursuing Allies. The psychological impact of movement, after 133 days of static warfare, operates powerfully on both sides. German troops, though withdrawing and yielding territory, experience a kind of relief. They are no longer defending impossible positions against waves of attacks. They are moving, relocating to ground they have prepared in advance, following orders that promise eventual stabilization on new defensive lines. The sense of being pressed back against a wall has lifted, replaced by the more conventional experience of military retreat, difficult and dangerous, but involving movement and purpose. Allied troops, by contrast, experience the exhilaration of breakthrough and pursuit, the grinding nature of siege warfare, the daily sacrifice of lives for hundreds of meters of terrain has been replaced by the faster-moving experience of chase and advance. Towns are liberated in succession, not in hours of grinding street-to-street fighting, but in hours of armored advance and quick engagements against rear guards. The casualty rates, while still significant, drop from the terrible toll of the winter and early spring battles. The Italian population in villages and towns encounters advancing Allied forces with increasing frequency and increasingly frank relief. German occupation has been replaced by German retreat. The long-awaited liberation approaches, city by city, town by town, village by village. The destruction wrought by the campaign becomes more visible as the front lines move forward and rear areas are occupied. The towns surrounding Cassino, the city itself, Piedemonte San Germano, the villages scattered across the valley floor, reveal the toll of months of fighting. Entire buildings have been reduced to rubble. Civilians have died in the hundreds, caught between armies fighting for control of terrain. Refugees, displaced by the fighting and bombing, mill about in the wake of German withdrawal. They seek information about family members, attempt to locate relatives killed or missing in the months of warfare. The Allies, advancing rapidly northward, can offer little immediate assistance beyond the provision that their advance prevents continued German occupation. The destruction is partly German, the deliberate destruction inflicted in defense and retreat. But much of it is Allied, the product of bombing campaigns designed to prevent German movement along roads and through rail yards, the product of artillery barrages that leveled positions but also devastated surrounding towns. The civilian toll of the campaign climbs as the scope of destruction becomes visible. Entire families emerge from basements and cellars, where they have sheltered for weeks or months, finding their homes destroyed, their livelihoods eliminated, the towns they knew transformed into landscapes of rubble and ash. The strategic significance of the breakthrough extends beyond the immediate tactical situation in Italy. The Wehrmacht is fighting simultaneous campaigns across Eastern Europe, where Soviet forces have advanced substantially, and is preparing for the anticipated invasion of France, which will commence less than 3 weeks after the Polish breakthrough at Cassino. Forces committed to defending or delaying in Italy cannot be shifted elsewhere. Kesselring's careful withdrawal preserves his armies, allows them to continue fighting, prevents their encirclement, but it also leaves Italy steadily to Allied control. German military planners in Berlin recognize the implications. The Mediterranean campaign, while secondary to the struggle in France and the Eastern Front, draws forces and resources that the Germans can increasingly ill afford to commit. The decision to retreat northward toward the Pisa-Rimini line, the next prepared defensive position where terrain again becomes difficult, represents a realistic assessment of German capabilities. The Wehrmacht can no longer conduct major offensive operations in Italy. It can conduct defense and delaying actions, buying time through tactical skill and defensive engineering. But the strategic initiative in the Mediterranean has passed to the Allies, and it will not return. The relationship between the breakthrough at Cassino and the subsequent rapid advance through the Liri Valley illuminates a fundamental principle of modern warfare. A fortress position, however carefully constructed and however staunchly defended, becomes vulnerable once its flanking terrain is compromised. The Gustav Line's strength derived partly from its linear defensive design, from the coordination of positions across difficult terrain. But its critical weakness was the degree to which its defensive advantage depended on holding the heights that commanded the valley floor. Once Monte Cassino fell, the entire system became compromised. German forces could have attempted to hold each position in sequence, fighting for every meter of terrain northward. Such resistance would have exacted casualties and slowed the Allied advance. But it would ultimately have proven futile. The Allies now possessed interior lines of communication through the valley, mechanized forces capable of rapid movement, air superiority preventing German concentration, and manpower reserves that exceeded German strength. The only rational German decision was withdrawal to terrain where defensibility could be re-established, where the next line of prepared positions offered resistance possibilities. where the cycle of defense and withdrawal could continue at a slower pace. Kesselring recognized this. He executed the withdrawal with the skill of an experienced commander, managing orderly retreat under pressure. Difficult, costly, but preserving his armies from destruction. The Soviet offensives that have been driving westward across Eastern Europe reach the suburbs of Warsaw and briefly approach East Prussia during this same period. The Red Army, having fought northward from the winter positions and through the spring thaw, advances along fronts that extend from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Japanese forces in the Pacific face the accelerating American advance through the Central Pacific toward the Philippines. The war in 1944 is becoming genuinely global, with multiple theaters reaching critical junctures. The Italian campaign, while drawing considerable resources and creating headlines about the liberation of Rome, represents a secondary front. The Wehrmacht must defend itself in three directions: northward against Soviet forces, eastward and southeastward in anticipation of the French invasion and the expected massive campaign in Western Europe, and southward in Italy against advancing American and British forces. The breakthrough at Cassino contributes one piece to a larger strategic picture. German strength is being depleted across multiple theaters faster than German industry can replace losses. The road to Rome opens not because German forces cease fighting, but because German forces cannot fight everywhere simultaneously. They must choose where to stand and fight, where to yield and withdraw. Italy has become increasingly peripheral to German strategic concerns. France and Eastern Europe claim priority. Italy becomes the arena of a slowly contracting German presence, defending successive lines and eventually abandoning the peninsula entirely. The human mathematics of the breakthrough reveals itself in casualty figures and troop movements. The Allies have suffered more than 120,000 casualties during the campaign for the Gustav Line, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. German casualties are estimated at roughly equivalent strength, perhaps 115,000 soldiers lost to death, wounds, and capture. Those figures accumulate across 133 days of fighting that rarely resulted in dramatic breakthroughs or strategic victories, instead grinding forward in increments measured in hundreds of meters, purchased at the cost of hundreds of lives. The Polish II Corps, less than 100,000 men when it arrived in March, suffered more than 4,000 casualties during its assault on Monte Cassino and the subsequent drive northward. The American divisions that assaulted the Gustav Line multiple times were reduced to roughly half their authorized strength by May. British units were similarly depleted. German divisions defending the line were also severely degraded. Many units commanded by junior officers after their senior leadership had been killed or severely wounded. Yet despite these losses and the breakthrough achieved, the fundamental character of the war in Italy does not transform into a war of rapid movement and encirclement. German forces retreat, yes, but they retreat in relative good order, establishing new defensive positions, preparing to fight again further north. The pursuit continues, but it will not be the pursuit of a defeated and dissolving army. It will be the pursuit of an army conducting a fighting withdrawal across terrain it does not want to hold, but will defend temporarily before retreating further. The breakthrough at Cassino is not, therefore, a decisive breakthrough that ends German capability to resist. It is a breakthrough that shatters one defensive line and allows the Allies to advance toward Rome, but which ultimately leads to months of additional fighting as German forces trade space for time and extract their price in Allied casualties before eventually withdrawing from Italy entirely. The road toward Rome stretches northward from the Liri Valley. towns and villages between Cassino and the Italian capital will be liberated, damaged or destroyed, experienced by civilians as months of warfare, bombing, and occupation. When the last shots fell silent on the slopes of Monte Cassino in mid-May of 1944, what remained was not celebration, but exhaustion. The price had been extracted from every soldier who climbed those scarred slopes, from every family back in Britain, America, Poland, and across the Commonwealth nations who received the dark telegram. To reckon the cost of this victory requires stepping away from maps and strategy, from the grand narratives of breakthrough and triumph, and into the terrible accounting of what was spent to break a line of fortifications on a single Italian mountain. The figures themselves are staggering. More than 120,000 Allied casualties across the entire campaign. German losses ran nearly as deep, but numbers alone cannot capture what was truly lost in those 4 months of grinding warfare that consumed the winter and spring of 1944. The human cost began not with the final assault, but with the first. When American and New Zealand forces began their attacks in January, the casualties came steadily, then relentlessly. Men froze to death in the mountains as winter gripped the heights. Others fell to artillery, to machine gun fire, to the endless grinding attrition of a battle where every 100 meters of ground required 500 casualties to secure. The American soldiers fighting in the lower sectors around the town of Cassino itself saw entire platoons reduced to squads. The New Zealand forces in the hills learned what it meant to attack uphill against entrenched defenders with artillery raining down from above. By the time February arrived with the bombing of the monastery, both the American Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army had already suffered losses that would have broken lesser forces. Yet the breakthrough they sought remained distant, elusive, defended by some of the finest soldiers Hitler possessed, the German 10th Army and its paratroopers, men who had fought across North Africa and Russia and understood the mechanics of defensive warfare with terrible precision. The bombing campaign itself, while not measured in immediate casualties in the traditional sense, created a different kind of suffering. Estimates vary widely, but approximately 200 people died in the monastery itself. Monks who had remained to protect the sacred relics, civilian refugees who had sought sanctuary within the ancient walls, and those who were simply in the wrong place when nearly 1,000 tons of ordnance rained down. The destruction was total and absolute. The structure that had stood for more than 1,400 years, that had survived invasions and earthquakes and the shifting fortunes of European civilization, was reduced to rubble in an afternoon. But this destruction did not break German resistance. Instead, it hardened it. The monastery's ruins became even better defensive positions, and the Germans moved in with grim satisfaction, preparing new fields of fire through what had once been sacred cloisters. The months that followed produced casualties without corresponding strategic gain. In the weeks after the bombing, the second major Allied assault on Monte Cassino resulted in failure. Waves of infantry, mostly American soldiers fighting conditions of mud and fog and cold that deepened their misery, threw themselves against German positions. The town of Cassino below the monastery was shattered by artillery fire, not by enemy bombardment, but by the Allies' own guns, trying to suppress German positions that could not be suppressed. Entire blocks of buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The civilian population that had not already fled found themselves living in conditions of complete devastation. Water sources became contaminated. Disease began to spread through the refugee camps where the displaced huddled for survival. What had been a working Italian town, with markets and churches and the ordinary rhythms of provincial life, became a ghost world of broken walls and shell craters. The Polish forces who arrived in March brought with them a different sort of desperation to the fighting. The men of General Władysław Anders's Polish II Corps had already fought across North Africa, enduring the chaos of earlier campaigns and the knowledge that their homeland remained under Nazi occupation. For these soldiers, the breakthrough at Cassino was not simply a military objective, it represented a concrete step toward liberation. Yet that desperation came with a cost, measured in blood and suffering. The Polish soldiers who assaulted the monastery ruins in May faced defenders who had learned through previous assaults exactly where the Allies would attack, what tactics they would employ, where artillery would fall. The fighting was close, hand to hand in many places, brutal in the way that only mountain warfare can be. The Polish flag planted on the ruins on the 18th of May came at a cost of approximately 4,000 casualties among the Polish corps alone during the final assault and the weeks of fighting that preceded it. Beyond the combat zones themselves, the collateral damage to the region was staggering. Entire villages were destroyed, not just damaged, but erased from the landscape. Sant'Ambrogio, Cassino itself, Cairo, and dozens of smaller settlements were reduced to rubble by artillery fire and bombing campaigns. The infrastructure of the region was shattered. Roads, bridges, water systems, and communication lines all fell victim to the destructive logic of modern warfare. Italian civilians who had nothing to do with military affairs found themselves displaced from their homes, living as refugees in camps, subject to disease and hunger and the constant uncertainty of whether they would ever be able to return. The agricultural land of the region, once productive, was torn to pieces by shell fire and made unsafe by unexploded ordnance. The Liri Valley, which should have provided sustenance for the local population, became a scarred landscape that would take years to recover. The German losses, though often less documented in Allied accounts, were equally severe. The German 10th Army defending the Gustav Line lost more than 60,000 men killed, wounded, and missing over the course of the campaign. For many of these soldiers, fighting under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the defensive line became a place of grinding attrition. German paratroopers, elite troops, trained for other purposes, found themselves committed piecemeal to defend against overwhelming numerical superiority. Artillery ammunition was expended in prodigious quantities on both sides. The German supply lines, stretched thin across the Italian peninsula and under constant attack from Allied aircraft, struggled to maintain flow. Desertion rates among German units increased as the winter ground on, as soldiers understood that the strategic situation was growing hopeless, that this line, like all lines, would eventually be broken. The psychological cost extended far beyond the fighting fronts. Families across America, Britain, Poland, Canada, South Africa, and other nations that contributed forces to the Cassino campaign received notifications